from a cabin engulfed in orange flame to a son aiming a rifle at his father in the snow, from Angela Bishop frozen over Bay Harbor butcher articles to Kurt Caldwell's trophy bunker glowing in sickly neon beneath a sleepy little town. These are the images Dexter New Blood wants us to remember. Redemption, reckoning, revelation, but look closer, and they start to blur. Why is the most wanted serial killer in Miami suddenly hiding in plain sight under a paper-thin alias? How does a small-town police chief leap from one partial Dina hit and a true crime podcast to Dexter Morgan is the Bay Harbor butcher without the investigation collapsing in court? Why does a decades-long kidnapping operation hum along beneath Iron Lake with almost no scrutiny? The more we replay these scenes, the more the show's own rules begin to crack. So let's kick things off with the central paradox. New Blood returns as a kind of narrative cleanup job, a chance to fix the original finale, to give Dexter's story a morally coherent end. Yet, in this video, we're going to argue that the biggest problem isn't just how it ends. It's how the entire season is built on plans, secrets, and investigations that disintegrate the second we actually test them for internal logic. Dexter tells himself he has finally achieved control, a decade of isolation, a strict routine, no kills, no mistakes. The fantasy is simple: new name, new town, new life. But every part of that plan depends on Iron Lake functioning as a believable world with consistent rules of law, psychology, and consequence. And that is exactly where the season starts to fail. The focus is not just on whether we like the finale, it's on where the story's own operating system breaks, and how those breaks quietly sabotage every major character arc. To keep this clear, each major section will track a different fault line. We'll start with Dexter's supposedly low profile in Iron Lake and ask how a man with his history leaves that many digital, physical, and behavioral trails without triggering real scrutiny. Then, we'll move into Harrison's psychology, his whiplash path from traumatized teenager to eager student of the code, and what that does to the emotional trajectory the season keeps promising, but never fully earns. From there, we'll dissect Angela's investigation, the shortcuts, the evidence gaps, the Bay Harbor butcher leap that would implode under the slightest legal pressure. We'll descend into Kurt's impossible logistics, his bunker, his hunting pattern, and how a town saturated with cops and tourists never truly connects the dots. And finally, we'll break down the rushed endgame, Dexter's arrest, his escape, his death, and why the supposed moral closure feels built on procedural sand. Along the way, the central question won't just be, is this bad writing? It will be, what happens to Dexter's entire myth of control when the world around him stops making sense? If Miami was a sprawling crime aquarium, Iron Lake is a snow globe, small, sealed, shaken the same way every day. We're told this town is a closed ecosystem where everyone knows everyone, gossip travels faster than Wi-Fi, and any outsider becomes a permanent entry in the collective case file. And yet, somehow, Dexter Morgan walks into that snow globe, calls himself Jim Lindsay, and becomes invisible, not just low profile, practically a ghost with a punch clock. Let's kick things off with what Jim actually is in this world. He's not living off the grid in a shack. He works at the local hunting store, selling guns and ammo in a community obsessed with deer season. He dates the police chief, he attends town events, hangs out at the bar, helps with the high school wrestling team. He is, by design, plugged into every social and law enforcement artery Iron Lake has. In this video, we're going to keep circling this same pressure point: visibility. Dexter's plan is to pretend that because he's quiet and polite, no one will ever ask the basic questions. for 10 years, in a place where the waitress knows how much cream you take in your coffee after 1 week. To keep this clear, think about the specific behaviors the show flags as quirks, then forgets to follow through on. Jim refuses to be photographed, dodging selfies and group shots like they're bullets. He's visibly uncomfortable with anything resembling a background check, even for work that involves firearms and hunting licenses. He shows an obsessive interest in police procedures, crime scenes, and Angela's investigation workload, always hovering just close enough to every major incident to feel uncanny. That's not subtle. That's a pattern that, in a real tiny town with a deeply intertwined police department, would trigger at least a quiet side conversation. Who is this man? Where did he come from? Why does he have no digital footprint beyond some light paperwork and a suspiciously clean record? The focus is not just on one missed clue. It's the cumulative psychology of a place like Iron Lake. We see bar regulars who can recite each other's traumas, cops who know every family tree, a chief who can track missing girls across state lines. And we're asked to believe that for a decade, nobody runs Jim's name deeper than the surface, nobody notices the inconsistencies, nobody wonders why their friendly gun clerk is a black hole of personal history. So the central question becomes unavoidable. In a town this small, with this level of law enforcement intimacy, how does a man with no real past, no online life, and a perfect behavioral record that feels engineered rather than lived, avoid even basic scrutiny? Along the way, New Blood keeps insisting that Iron Lake is perceptive enough to sniff out serial killers like Kurt and unravel the Bay Harbor butcher case from a podcast, but somehow too blind to interrogate the ghost living in plain sight. That contradiction is our first major plot hole, and it sets the trajectory for every investigation failure that follows. So when New Blood asks us to believe Dexter can date the police chief for months without his alias cracking, we hit a different level of disbelief. This is not Iron Lake ignoring a weird guy at the bait shop. This is Iron Lake's top cop sharing a bed, a house, and a life with a man whose entire plan depends on her never typing his name. Because let's kick things off with the reality of being the police chief's boyfriend. In real departments, officers run plates on new cars, run names on new neighbors, and casually check databases when something feels off. It's not always formal. It's not always ethical. But it happens. The psychology is simple. When your job is risk assessment, you use the tools you have on the people closest to you. So when Angela sees Jim Lindsay's truck at every crime scene, watches him break up fights, and involves him in an active investigation, we're supposed to believe she never once runs his license, his social, or his fingerprints? To keep this clear, we're in a post-Bay Harbor butcher world. Dexter Morgan is not an obscure missing person from Miami. He is nationally infamous. His face, his case, the entire investigation live in federal databases, old news segments, true crime podcasts, facial recognition, INSIC hits, cross-reference driver's licenses. These are standard, automated systems. The central question becomes, how does a man whose biometric data, employment history, and death certificate are all tied to that face get to reinvent himself as Jim Lindsay without a single digital alarm bell ringing? The show even hands Angela perfect opportunities to notice the cracks, then looks away. At the Christmas party, Jim is orbiting half the town's law enforcement, photographed, tagged, and texted. School events put him on camera again, in a small community where every parent is one Facebook search away. During the Matt Caldwell investigation, Angela is already running background checks, pulling travel records, coordinating with state and federal systems. She has both motive and opportunity to widen that search by one click and ask. Who exactly is this helpful boyfriend who keeps showing up in my reports? And when she does finally dig, New Blood rushes straight from podcast +1 file to Bay Harbor Butcher with almost no procedural connective tissue. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between the tools these characters have and the way they inexplicably refuse to use them. The focus is not just on plot convenience. It's on a pattern of self-inflicted blindness that mirrors Dexter's own illusion of control. Each major section will trace a similar collapse. The investigation stalls not because the clues are weak, but because the script needs smart people to act selectively incompetent. Along the way, we'll see that this isn't just an alias problem. It's the operating system of New Blood's entire trajectory. If the investigation around Dexter in Iron Lake feels fragile, Dexter himself blows it wide open. The collapse doesn't start with Angela's board or Kurt's bunker. It starts the moment New Blood rewires Dexter's basic survival plan. Let's kick things off by remembering who Dexter used to be. In Miami, every kill was a ritual of control. Stalk the target. Confirm the victims. Prepare the kill room. Leave no evidence. He used abandoned buildings, remote spaces, plastic-wrapped rooms, and ocean dumps, all calculated to keep the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation chasing shadows. Even when his plans failed, the failure came from unpredictable variables, not from Dexter suddenly forgetting the code that kept him alive. Cut to Iron Lake, and the psychology shifts overnight. Dexter has gone 10 years without killing, supposedly to protect his new identity. Then, Matt Caldwell waves a gun at some deer, and Dexter's dark passenger doesn't just nudge him. It sprints straight through every rule he ever lived by. He murders Matt in a hunting cabin, in a tight-knit town, during hunting season, with local cops and armed neighbors all over the woods. No plastic, no controlled environment, no real exit strategy. How does that line up with a man whose entire trajectory was built on never making the obvious mistake? To keep this clear, look at the risk profile of that first kill. Fresh snow, which records every footprint. A known location that multiple people saw Dexter visit. A victim who is not some invisible predator, but a rich, infuriating regular, with a powerful father and a history of public incidents. There's a clear motive, a noisy altercation at the bar, and a crime scene Dexter can't fully sanitize because it's not his space. It's almost as if the script chooses the most traceable scenario possible and then asks us to believe the same brain that outmaneuvered the Miami Metro investigation for years is fine with it. From there, the chain reaction feels less like tragedy and more like design. Dexter's sloppy cover-up leaves traces. The dog finds the bloody glove he missed. He dumps Matt's body near his own property in a town where everyone knows who owns which land. He inserts himself into Angela's search, volunteers information, and constantly hovers around the investigation that any rational version of Dexter would avoid at all costs. Why is the supposed master of compartmentalization suddenly magnetized to the crime scene? The central question isn't just why does he kill again, but why he kills this way. The focus is not just on a man relapsing, it's on a writer's room that needs Dexter back in motion. Fast, each major section will keep showing this pattern. To get the plot moving, New Blood dials down Dexter's intelligence and caution until his exposure stops feeling inevitable in a tragic sense and starts feeling inevitable in a mechanical, scripted sense. And once that first fracture opens, the rest of Iron Lake's logic has to contort itself to keep up. So let's follow that contortion out into the snow, because Iron Lake itself becomes the biggest accomplice in Dexter's illusion of control. The town doesn't just host the story, it reshapes its own size, memory, and basic logic on command, so Dexter can both hide in plain sight and be dramatically exposed on cue. On one day, Iron Lake is framed like a tiny village. One main street, one bar, one cop shop where everybody knows Angela, everybody knows Jim Lindsay, and gossip travels faster than the plows. In a place that intimate, a guy who never drinks, never dates, never leaves town except to hunt, and has a mysterious decade-long backstory should light up every social radar. And yet, when the plot needs cover, Iron Lake expands. Suddenly it's big enough that a Bay Harbor butcher living under an alias can clock in at a public-facing job, pull knives on local troublemakers, and still pass as just another quiet face in the crowd. That same elastic scale shows up in law enforcement. To keep this clear, think about the department we actually see. It's a handful of officers, one overworked chief, and a budget that looks barely adequate for traffic stops and bar fights. Then, the story flips a switch, and this tiny team is running multi-state investigations, cross-referencing Miami cold cases, and pulling Dina hits like a mid-sized city homicide unit. The investigation into Matt, into Kurt, into Dexter's past. All rely on resources we never see them have, and procedures they routinely ignore. And yet, for all that sudden competence, they miss the obvious. A decade of missing girls tied to the same geographic area. A powerful local family with rumors of abuse, secret cash, and a private compound. A literal underground trophy room where Kurt has been embalming victims for years. In any remotely consistent world, that pattern would trigger state police, federal task forces, journalists, somebody. Instead, Iron Lake's institutional memory is wiped clean until Angela personally connects the dots, as if no one else ever even tried. This selective amnesia is where the central question of New Blood's world building really shows itself. Is Iron Lake hyper-observant, or is it willfully blind? It has to be both. People notice Dexter enough that one suspicious needle mark, one old case file, one true crime podcast can crack his entire life open. But they don't notice enough to ask why his paperwork, his past, his sudden arrival right after a hurricane in Miami never triggered deeper scrutiny. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that paradox because the focus is not just on Dexter's personal failure. It's on a town whose psychology bends around him, inflating and shrinking, remembering and forgetting, just enough to keep the plot alive. And once we bring Harrison into that warped ecosystem, the consequences of that bending get even stranger. Once Harrison walks into Iron Lake High, the town doesn't just bend around Dexter anymore. It starts warping around this kid who's supposed to be the emotional core of New Blood. And right away, the investigation isn't into a crime scene, it's into his psychology. Let's kick things off with how he's introduced to us. Harrison appears as a traumatized runaway, a teenager who tracked down Jim Lindsay after a decade of abandonment, carrying a letter from Hannah and a backpack that might as well be labeled unresolved consequences. He says he's been in foster care, drifting, using drugs, self-harming. The performance, the framing, the dialogue with Dexter in that cabin all point to the same thing: a damaged kid who wants stability, honesty, and some version of a real father. To keep this clear, the plan the show sells us is simple. Harrison will test Dexter's new life, pressure his illusion of control, and maybe offer a chance at redemption. We see him crave connection with Audrey, cling to the wrestling team, respond to Angela's warmth. The early trajectory is grounded in trauma and attachment, not in blood and blades. Then, almost overnight, he becomes a violent prodigy. One episode, he's shaky and uncertain. The next, he's dismantling a bigger wrestler with a precision chokehold, slashing a bully's leg with a razor, and standing over the blood like it's a mirror instead of a trigger. The same kid who supposedly fled a life of danger is suddenly drawn, with uncanny, narrative GPS, to exactly the kinds of situations that echo Dexter's past: school predator, hunting culture, vigilante fantasies. From a therapy circle where he calls out hypocrisy, to that podcast about the Bay Harbor Butcher, to the instant fascination with Dexter's knives, every beat pushes him toward the code with almost no believable ramp. In this video, we're going to keep asking, where is the actual psychological work here? Where are the failed interventions, the misdiagnoses, the slow, messy escalation that would make this transformation feel earned instead of pre-programmed? The tonal whiplash is brutal. One moment, Harrison is a vulnerable teen begging Dexter for honesty about why he left, crying in the truck after the school incident. The next, he's a near psychopathic mirror, grinning at the idea of channeling his darkness, casually helping Dexter set up Kurt's kill without flinching at the bodies in that bunker. Then, in the finale, he's suddenly the moral compass, the one who sees Dexter's pattern as a total collapse rather than a heroic plan gone wrong. So the central question becomes unavoidable. Who is Harrison actually supposed to be? A budding serial killer shaped by a corrupted code? A damaged but salvageable kid who can break the cycle? Or just a narrative device engineered to force Dexter's end, no matter how many turns his characterization has to take on 2 days' notice? When one character has to serve all 3 roles at once, the psychology fractures and the whole season's emotional stakes start to look less like tragedy and more like strategy. And once we follow that fracture into the finale, into the way the show uses Harrison to justify its last irreversible decision about Dexter, the plot holes don't just widen, they become the point. So let's kick things off with the strangest time jump in Dexter history, the one that doesn't actually exist on screen. Harrison goes from Jim Lindsay is my awkward small-town dad to my father has a dark passenger to I'm helping wrap plastic in Kurt's kill bunker to I'm executing Dexter in the woods in what feels like narrative fast-forward. No seasons, no real decompression, just a hard cut from suspicion to complicity to murder. To keep this clear, we can track it almost like an investigation board. First, the reveal: Dexter admits the truth, not just about killing, but about the code, Harry, and Miami. Then, almost immediately, we're in the father-son bonding montage. They share vigilante fantasies. They trade stories of trauma. They stalk Kurt together. The show presents this as catharsis, as if the psychology of a boy abandoned in blood can be resolved by handing him a rifle and a moral algorithm. From the cabin hunt to the plastic-covered room, the focus is not just on Dexter finally letting someone in, but on how completely his lifelong obsession with control evaporates. For 8 seasons, Dexter would rather sabotage relationships, fake emotions, even frame other people than expose his secret. Here, after 10 years of hiding in Iron Lake, he walks Harrison into a kill room like it's a trust fall exercise. No incremental testing, no boundaries. Just, here's my entire secret life. Want to help? That's not character evolution. That's the season sprinting for a finale. And Harrison's reactions fracture just as quickly. He's horrified by Rita's death, by the idea that Dexter left a trail of bodies across Miami. He flinches at the blood, at what Deb became, at the Bay Harbor Butcher label. Then, moments later, he's exhilarated, high on the idea of taking out the trash. Almost giddy as they confront Kurt. Where is the sleepless night between those states? Where is the episode where he pulls back, questions the plan, tests the code against real-world consequences? In this video, we're going to keep returning to that gap between stated trauma and displayed behavior, because it's where the whole trajectory of New Blood collapses. Harrison's acceptance of the code, then his sudden rejection of it, doesn't unfold like a teenager wrestling with inherited violence. It moves like a switch the writers flip whenever they need Dexter closer to death. One episode, Harrison is the apprentice. The next, he's the executioner, declaring that Dexter has broken the code beyond repair. The central question becomes, is Harrison changing, or is the script dragging him? Along the way, every beat of his psychology seems calibrated less to explore what it means to be Dexter's son, and more to justify putting a bullet in Dexter without a longer investigation, a trial, or time for either of them to confront what they actually are. And that rushed transformation sets up the final, fatal plan we'll look at next, Dexter's last escape attempt, and the way the show bends reality to make sure he never walks away again. And nowhere is that bending of reality clearer than in the place that's supposed to be the most grounded, Harrison's school therapy group. We move from life and death plans in cabins and jail cells to a circle of folding chairs in a gym. And somehow, the collapse of believability gets even sharper. On paper, this is the perfect setting. A mandatory group for students after a school threat, a licensed therapist, kids talking about self-harm, violence, and belonging. If any space in New Blood should let us track Harrison's psychology with real nuance, it's this one. In this video, we're going to treat that group as its own investigation, what the show promises that room will do, and what it actually uses it for. Let's kick things off with the first big session. We watch Harrison sit among traumatized classmates, listen to stories of fear, anger, and isolation, and then deliver that razor-edged speech about wanting to hurt the bullies. It's intense. It's framed as a breakthrough. But look at how the scene functions. Within minutes, it pivots from potential long-term character work to a convenient exposition dump and foreshadowing device for the looming school attack storyline. The focus is not just on what Harrison says, but on what the narrative refuses to do afterward. There's no real follow-up investigation by the school, no credible risk assessment, no mandated deeper evaluation when a kid basically outlines violent ideation in front of a professional. Instead, the consequences are mostly symbolic. The other teens are impressed. The therapist is unsettled. And the plot quietly checks a box that says, Harrison has darkness too. To keep this clear, Harrison's vulnerability is always calibrated to the next plot beat, not to a believable emotional trajectory. He opens up just enough to trigger a gossip wave, just enough to justify his sudden popularity, just enough to make his later attraction to Dexter's code feel pre-approved by the script. Then, right when we might expect sessions that dig into abandonment, Miami, Rita's death, or even specific memories of Dexter, the group scenes evaporate. No slow build, no relapse, no real collapse. We're left with a character who can confess violent impulses in one episode, play normal at a party in the next, and then nod along to vigilante murder as if the therapy never existed. Where is the struggle between what he said in that circle and what he does in the snow? Where is the tension between professional help and Dexter's lethal mentorship? Each major section will briefly gesture at that conflict, then cut away before it can threaten the plan to rush toward the finale. And that leads us to a darker question. If Harrison's inner life is this thinly sketched even under clinical observation, what does that say about Angela? She's the character positioned as the one person who can see through lies, track patterns, and hold people accountable. But if the show can flatten Harrison right in front of a therapist, how much can we trust the investigation logic of the woman who's supposed to read everyone else more clearly than they read themselves? If Harrison is being read through a fog, Angela is framed as the one person who can cut through it. She's the control variable the show keeps pointing to. Small-town police chief, single mom, war veteran, and the only character whose entire plan is built on investigation rather than instinct or fantasy. On paper, that's a powerful design. Angela walks Iron Lake in uniform and out of it, moving from crime scenes to parenting to council meetings, carrying this quiet moral gravity. The focus is not just on her rank, but on the way the season positions her, the one person with both the authority and the conscience to expose Kurt Caldwell's hunting ground and Dexter's past life as the Bay Harbor Butcher. In a story obsessed with codes, she's supposed to be the one character whose code actually holds. And conceptually, a competent, grounded cop slowly realizing her boyfriend is a legendary serial killer is exactly the kind of slow burn collapse New Blood needed. The central question could have been, what happens when genuine, methodical police work finally catches up to Dexter's decade of hiding, not because he slips into cartoonish failure, but because someone else is actually better at control than he is? But let's kick things off by acknowledging the fracture line. Angela's brilliance doesn't emerge from a coherent investigative trajectory. It arrives in bursts, right on cue, whenever the story needs a jolt. 1 minute, she's running a sharp missing persons operation, pushing back on the town's denial around runaway girls. The next, the investigation jumps 3 steps ahead because a podcast host happens to hand her the exact Bay Harbor Butcher lore she needs, precisely when Dexter re-enters her life. Is that police work or narrative gravity? From a blood trail in the snow to a single old Miami case file and a partial Dina link, Angela's arc keeps skipping the boring but necessary connective tissue. There's no real chain of custody, no visible federal follow-up, no sense of jurisdictional tug-of-war once a supposed mass murder legend is on the table. Instead, she stares at a printer page, listens to a true crime episode, and suddenly the alias in Iron Lake is fused to the monster from Miami. Each major section will try to sell this as hard-won detective insight, but the scaffolding underneath is paper thin. To keep this clear, we're not questioning Angela's psychology or morality. We're questioning the plan the writers built around her. She should be the anti-Dexter, process-driven where he improvises, evidence-based where he rationalizes. Yet along the way, her successes feel less like the payoff of painstaking investigation and more like the script tossing her exactly the right clue at exactly the right time. In this video, we're going to track how that pattern intensifies, from the Dina hit to the Bay Harbor Butcher connection to the final arrest. We'll see how Angela's story is propped up by shortcuts that wouldn't survive a real case file, or even the internal logic of Dexter's earlier seasons. So when she finally corners him, is that justice, or just another illusion of control? So let's kick things off by grounding this in reality, because without that, the whole New Blood Dina storyline feels weightless. In an actual investigation, Dina is not a magic keyword you type into a computer. It's a process. Collect the sample without contamination. Preserve it in sealed, labeled packaging. Maintain a documented chain of custody that tracks every person who touches it. Then, send it to a certified lab where technicians generate a profile that can be compared against known samples or databases. Each of those steps is a potential point of failure. A mislabeled tube, a broken seal, an unauthorized transfer, any one of those can get a result challenged or thrown out. To keep this clear, real detectives don't just need a match. They need to prove how that match was handled, who authorized it, and why it points to a specific suspect rather than just someone with similar DNA. Now contrast that with what we see in Dexter, New Blood, We get the mysterious syringe from the ketamine victim, the old Miami evidence from the Bay Harbor butcher years, and Angela apparently gliding between them as if jurisdictions. Storage protocols and federal oversight barely exist. A podcaster hands her a narrative. A quick trip to Florida gives her a file. Suddenly, she's tying Dexter to a decade-old massacre and a current murder with almost no procedural friction. Where did that Miami evidence sit for years? In a climate-controlled facility with strict access logs. Or in a metaphorical plot closet waiting for Angela to open it? Who actually approves shipping out materials connected to one of the most infamous serial killer investigations in the country? We never see supervisors, lawyers, or federal agents pushing back. No internal affairs. No FBI. Just Angela, a small-town chief, walking through what should be a bureaucratic minefield like it's a self-checkout lane. The central question is not whether Angela could ever connect Dexter through Dina. It's whether she could do it this fast, this cleanly, and this alone. The focus is not just on the hit itself, but on the missing steps. No motions to access sealed evidence, no chain of custody disputes, no lab backlogs, no cross-agency turf wars. For a case that would trigger national headlines, the investigation unfolds like a private side quest, and that's where the illusion of control snaps. The Dina trail doesn't play like a hard-won breakthrough in a messy, contested investigation. It plays like a narrative shortcut designed to justify Angela's suspicions without giving her the investigative journey that would make her victory feel earned. Along the way, New Blood abandons the forensic rigor that once made Dexter vulnerable. The blood slides, the boat logs, the subtle patterns, and replaces it with a single, convenient chain of evidence that never really has to prove it can hold. Because if the show slowed down and honored every link in that chain, what else would it have to admit about Dexter's past, Miami Metro's failures, and the institutions that let the Bay Harbor butcher vanish in the first place? So when Angela finally does slow down, the show instantly speeds her up. One suspicious body. One needle mark. And suddenly, we're not in Iron Lake anymore. We're back in the shadow of the Bay Harbor butcher, as if a decade of lore can be crossed with a single, wobbly step. To keep this clear, let's reconstruct the chain the writers hand us. Angela hears about a perfect overdose. She notices a tiny puncture on Miles' neck. That image jogs a half-remembered story about Dexter once working in Miami, and about a mass murder case she was never personally involved in. In the space of a few scenes, that vague memory fuses with a podcast and a Google search, and suddenly she's staring at Dexter as if she's Dokes, Lundy, and the entire FBI task force rolled into one. From a local drug death to a federal-level serial killer investigation in 3 narrative moves. No backup, no jurisdictional maze, no real resistance. The central question becomes, are we watching Angela do good police work, or are we watching the show reach for the fastest possible way to connect Iron Lake to Dexter's greatest hits? Look at what she skips. A bad batch of opioids. A paramedic cutting corners. A doctor with a prescription racket. Even another local predator, which would track perfectly with Kurt's established operation already on her radar. In a world where a man has been abducting women for years and preserving their bodies in a bunker, why is the most plausible explanation for one suspicious needle mark this must be a legendary Miami serial killer in hiding? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between realistic procedure and narrative convenience. Here, the gap is filled almost entirely by Molly Park and the internet. Instead of interagency cooperation, subpoenas, and dense case files, we get a true crime episode and some online sleuthing. Molly's podcast becomes a cheat code. It compresses seasons of investigation, surveillance, and institutional failure into a digestible story Angela can binge and then project onto the man she's dating. The focus is not just on how flimsy that is as an investigation, but on what it does to the Bay Harbor butcher mythology. In the original run, that case was built from tiny details: blood slides, boat logs, dump sites, Dokes' instincts, LaGuerta's obsession. It took years, careers, and lives. Here, the same monster is solved by a sheriff in a small town who listens to a podcast, prints one old case file, and cross-references a partial Dina hit with almost no visible federal follow-up. Along the way, Angela's competence collapses into plot function. She's smart enough to make the cosmic leap, but not methodical enough to test every ordinary explanation first. And the writers get what they want: Dexter's past crashing into his present on schedule, even if the bridge between them can't really bear its own weight. The next steps in her investigation will only push that strain further. And here's where the whole thing really buckles. Angela's investigation doesn't just strain plausibility. It operates like there's evidence without a case, procedure without any actual procedural backbone. To keep this clear, let's kick things off with what Angela actually has in her hands. She's got circumstantial connections: Jim Lindsay's arrival in Iron Lake right after Dexter Morgan's death, his weirdly intimate knowledge of crime scene logistics, his instinctive interest in every missing kid and violent incident. She's got a suspicious overdose in Miles, a guy Dexter conveniently antagonized, who just happens to die right after a confrontation. She's got a tenuous gnaw link from the needle mark on Miles's neck, which points to a synthetic opioid Dexter once used in Miami, not to Dexter himself. And she's got evasive behavior, lies about his past, a fake identity, a guy who visibly stiffens every time the word Miami is spoken. That's smoke. It's not fire. It's the outline of a plan, not a finished investigation. What would she actually need to credibly say, "You're the Bay Harbor butcher"? Multiple verified crime scenes tied to a single offender, corroborating witnesses who can place Dexter at key moments or connect him to missing people, official Miami files, including the full Bay Harbor Butcher casebook, forensics, internal memos, all of it properly obtained, and, crucially, support from state or federal agencies, because we're talking about reopening a nationally infamous serial killer case, not a parking ticket. Instead, Angela prints a podcast transcript, grabs one old Miami report, runs a local Dina test, and suddenly we're at, "You're the butcher, aren't you?" Where is the DA saying, "Slow down, this is inadmissible"? Where's the state police asking why a small town chief is unilaterally resurrecting a closed federal investigation? Where are her superiors, her town council, anyone, questioning why Iron Lake's limited resources are being used to chase a legend from another season and another jurisdiction? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this missing friction. There's no skepticism, no jurisdictional turf war, no internal affairs sniffing around after she arrests a local celebrity hunting guide and then pivots to accusing her boyfriend of being a historic mass murderer. The central question becomes, how does Angela leap from "my boyfriend is hiding something" to "I have enough to confront a mythic serial killer" without anyone in the system pulling the emergency brake? The focus is not just on Angela being smart or intuitive, it's on the structural collapse around her. New Blood wants the emotional weight of that interrogation room, of Dexter finally being named as the Bay Harbor Butcher, without doing the narrative work to earn that level of certainty. Along the way, the show skips the grind of subpoenas, interagency calls, chain of custody battles, and political consequences that would normally define this kind of investigation. And that shortcut doesn't stay contained to Angela. It bleeds directly into how Dexter is arrested, how he escapes, and how his final plan to stay in control disintegrates in the finale. And nowhere does that shortcut logic feel more blatant than with Kurt Caldwell's impossible murder bunker. On the surface, it's one of New Blood's most striking images: a lonely truck stop, a hidden elevator. Then we descend into that neon-lit mausoleum, rows of preserved bodies, posed behind glass like frozen mannequins, each victim sealed in their own vertical coffin. The floor is immaculate. The lighting is theatrical. The whole place feels less like a kill site and more like a serial killer art installation in a small town where everyone knows who owns which acre. We're suddenly in a secret underground cathedral to control. The central question is not whether this looks chilling. It does. The question is, how does any of this exist in Iron Lake without the entire town knowing? To keep this clear, we're talking about a large, high-tech facility dug under a seemingly ordinary property, with power, ventilation, climate control, reinforced glass, and an elevator system. In the real world, that means contractors, permits, inspections, noise, and years of locals watching construction equipment roll in and out. Here, we're asked to believe Kurt just willed it into being. Think about the logistics. Excavation on that scale would shake the ground. Concrete pours, steel deliveries, electrical work, specialized glass, all of it leaves a trail. At minimum, there are invoices, workers, supply runs, and someone in the county office asking why this guy's utility usage just spiked. Instead, the investigation that can track Dexter's decade-old Dina across state lines never once brushes up against the massive power draw of an underground morgue glowing like a nightclub. Then there's day-to-day operation. Bodies don't magically preserve themselves. There's soundproofing so no one hears screams, smell control so no one gets a whiff of decomposition, and constant cleaning to keep that showroom shine. Refrigerants, chemicals, replacement parts for the elevator. Kurt is supposedly running all of this while also being a very public figure, a benefactor, a coach, a man constantly in photos and at town events. How many missing girls can vanish around his roots before someone asks why the common denominator is the guy with the secret basement? In this video, we're going to keep returning to this pattern. The focus is not just on what looks good on screen, but on whether the world can survive even mild scrutiny. Kurt's bunker becomes a microcosm of New Blood's entire trajectory. Chilling imagery first, basic causality second. It's the same psychology we see with Dexter's alias, with Angela's investigation, with Harrison's rushed adoption of the code. Each major section will show another place where the plan is to shock us in the moment, and the consequence is that once the moment passes, the story quietly collapses in our hands. And if Kurt's impossible bunker feels like too much, the next failure takes that same instinct and applies it directly to Dexter's final escape. If Kurt's impossible bunker feels like too much on a logistical level, the town that lets that bunker exist is where the story fully loses control. Because once we zoom out from one killer's secret basement to the wider pattern of missing girls, we're not just talking about a weird cabin in the woods. We're talking about a whole region that should be a national crime story, and instead behaves like nothing is happening. Let's kick things off with the implied body count. New Blood makes it clear that Kurt has been doing this for years. Decades, really. Runaways, drifters, local girls, all vanishing along the same highway corridors, in the same weather. With the same last known contact point, Kurt's truck stop, and that lonely stretch of road he rescues them from. In a town the size of Iron Lake, even 10 disappearances on that route would be a crisis. The show quietly implies several times that we're well past that. We're in dozens territory. In the real world, that's where the entire trajectory of a place changes. Serial disappearances along a single corridor don't just sit in a filing cabinet. They trigger media attention, state police task forces, FBI profilers, pressure from families, protests on courthouse steps, reporters camp at the truck stop, parents tell their daughters not to hitchhike, not to work late, not to walk home alone. Town councils hold emergency meetings, sheriffs lose elections. That's how this pattern works when the consequences are allowed to exist. But Iron Lake never looks like a town that's been losing women for 20 years. There's no aging bulletin board of faces in the police station, no cold case wall, no old timers trading stories about that stretch of route whatever you don't drive after dark. Angela is basically alone, poking at Matt's disappearance and then Iris, with no visible long-term investigation, no state police, no FBI, no outside experts. The psychology of a community under siege is missing. Instead, Iron Lake's mood is small-town Christmas festival with the occasional awkward protest. The central question becomes, how are Kurt and Dexter both operating here without the world crashing in? To keep this clear, the focus is not just on one lazy cop or one corrupt mayor. It's that the entire narrative has to seal Iron Lake off from logical reaction, so two different serial killers can run their plans in parallel. Kurt can abduct, imprison, embalm, and display victims in an underground shrine. Dexter can live under an alias, work at a gun shop, befriend the police chief, and still slip out at night to kill. And the town barely twitches. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that vacuum. Because once you notice that Iron Lake never pays the price its premise demands, Dexter's final escape attempt, Angela's investigation, and even Harrison's adoption of the code all start to feel like they're happening on a stage, not in a world. And the next failure is where that stage finally collapses under Dexter himself. That stage feeling is not accidental. It's the consequence of every major pillar of New Blood asking us to believe that smart, resourced people will repeatedly ignore their own intelligence, their own training, and basic common sense just so Dexter's illusion of control can wobble in the right direction. Let's kick things off with Dexter's low profile. On paper, the plan is airtight. New name, small town, quiet job. But in practice, we watch him work at a gun shop, date the chief of police, hang around crime scenes, access restricted databases, and leave a decade of digital and employment records without a single serious background check. From a modern policing perspective, that's not stealth. That's a flashing red light no one in Iron Lake bothers to look at. Harrison's psychology is built on the same selective blindness. He's traumatized, abandoned, self-harming, and yet he's also delivering articulate monologues about monsters and justice, then pivoting into instant interest in the code. The focus is not just on whether he's dark like Dexter. It's on how quickly the season demands he accept vigilante murder as a viable moral option, with almost no therapy, no external support, and no grounded exploration of consequences. His inner life bends to whatever the plot needs him to believe this week. Angela's investigation should be the counterweight. She has motive, training, and a personal stake. Instead, her arc lurches between sharp insight and narrative amnesia. She can connect a titanium screw from Matt's body to Dexter, leap from a Miami podcast to Bay Harbor Butcher, and pull a single old case file that magically bridges a decade of federal investigation gaps. But she somehow never locks down a proper chain of evidence, never calls in the full weight of outside agencies, and repeatedly confronts suspects alone in ways that break procedure. Then there's Kurt's operation, the most literal underground secret in Iron Lake. We're told he's been abducting women for years, embalming their bodies in a fully built bunker, using trucks, fuel, surveillance, and cash, all while the town shrugs at a missing persons rate that should trigger state or federal scrutiny. How does that bunker get constructed, supplied, and powered without any contractor, inspector, or utility worker asking a single question? To keep this clear, each major section will keep looping back to the same pattern: Dexter's cover, Harrison's morality, Angela's case, and Kurt's hunting ground don't just fail individually. They intersect in ways that amplify the collapse. Angela's suspicion of Dexter spikes right as Kurt's trophies are exposed. Harrison's loyalty fractures the moment he has to choose between his father's code and any coherent sense of justice. And the town's obliviousness is what lets all of these threads tighten around Dexter in the finale without ever feeling earned. By the time we reach the last episode, the central question isn't which decision breaks the story, it's how did any of these storylines stand up this long when every foundation was already cracked? Along the way, New Blood has been staging an elaborate illusion of inevitability. In the next sections, we're going to walk step by step through Dexter's arrest, his escape attempts, the final character turns, and his death itself, and ask a harder question. Do those climactic moments actually follow from the season we just watched, or are they the writer's final, desperate kill room for their own story? And nowhere is that desperation clearer than in the one thing New Blood absolutely could not afford to fudge: Harrison's trauma. To keep this clear, we need to lay out the basic math. In the original series, Harrison is born in season 4. Rita dies when he's a baby, barely old enough to sit in a pool of blood, not old enough to form narrative memories. Then we jump. New Blood takes place roughly 10 years after Dexter sails into the storm. On screen, Harrison is presented as 16, carrying himself more like a world-weary 20-year-old than a kid who spent most of his life in foster care and off-screen limbo. The central question: what does Harrison actually remember? The show wants him to recall Rita's murder with cinematic clarity. We get lines and flashbacks where he talks about that night, about being left in blood, as if he watched Trinity with adult comprehension. That's not how early childhood memory works, and it's not how Dexter framed that event in the original seasons. Back then, the trauma belonged to Dexter. Harrison was the echo, the symbol, not an eyewitness with a detailed internal monologue. Yet in Iron Lake, Harrison weaponizes those memories during arguments, therapy scenes, and especially when he confronts Dexter. He describes abandonment, betrayal, blood, as if he's been running an internal investigation on his own origin story for a decade. The focus is not just on emotional exaggeration, it's on the writers using impossible recall as a shortcut to instant stakes. Why build a slow, messy relationship when you can have Harrison say, "You left me in all that blood," and skip straight to operatic resentment? At the same time, we're told this kid is deeply damaged. Self-harm, violent fantasies, a school attack he prevents, but clearly identifies with. Yet, he walks into Iron Lake High and becomes instantly charismatic, socially fluent, magnetic to Audrey and the wrestling team. Trauma this severe usually disrupts attachment, trust, basic regulation. Here, it selectively vanishes whenever the plot needs Harrison to be the cool new kid. Where's the collapse? Where's the loss of control that would mirror Dexter's own? Then there are the specific scenes that break the illusion completely. Harrison confronting Dexter about the Bay Harbor butcher after listening to a podcast. Harrison hallucinating or imagining blood in ways that line up more with Dexter's psychology than his own lived experience. Harrison accepting the idea of a code after a single kill with his father, as if a lifetime of confusion and pain were just waiting for the right brand label. In this video, we're going to argue that this is why his acceptance of Dexter's code feels rushed and dramatically hollow. A real teenager with fragmented, uncertain memories would question, resist, relapse. Instead, Harrison's trauma bends on command to fit each scene's plan. And along the way, those impossible memories set up an even bigger contradiction we'll hit next. How a boy allegedly broken by blood can pivot so quickly into a willing apprentice of it. So when we cut from that manufactured memory of blood to Harrison's first real scenes in Iron Lake, the trajectory the show chooses is jarring. The central question becomes, is this a traumatized, fragmented kid or the coolest transfer student this school has ever seen? Let's kick things off with how he's introduced. Harrison walks into Iron Lake High like he's already decoded the social map. He charms the guidance counselor. He trades quick, confident banter with Audrey. Within minutes, he's on the wrestling team, navigating cliques, parties, and petty rivalries with an ease that completely ignores the alleged collapse of his childhood. No foster care scars, no awkwardness about authority, no visible investigation into his past. The focus is not just on what he says, but on how the camera and dialogue tell us, over and over, that this kid is effortlessly adaptive. Then, we hit the school set pieces. The wrestling practice, where he bodies the bully with surgical precision. The party, where he drinks, flirts, and slides into the popular crowd. The overdose incident, where he both witnesses and intervenes in a life-or-death moment. On paper, each major section will hint at a dark passenger waking up. In execution, they feel like disconnected beats in a plan to fast-track him into Dexter 2.0 without doing the psychology in between. Watch how the tone swings. In the overdose scene, Harrison is horrified, compassionate, almost desperate to keep this kid alive. He calls for help. He stays present. It reads as genuine empathy. But in the wrestling match, he cranks the violence up with an almost gleeful focus, wrenching the arm, holding the move, basking in the shock. Later, the straight razor incident layers that same thrill over something even more intimate and dangerous. One moment, he's the sensitive survivor. The next, he's performing cruelty like a practiced act. To keep this clear, these shifts aren't gradual. There's no sustained inner monologue, no therapy, no consistent push-pull between wanting control and fearing collapse. We get a few moody sketches, a couple of blow-ups, and then he's suddenly fluent in Dexter's language of urges, patterns, and the code, as if violent logic is hereditary. Does trauma really translate that cleanly into a father's rulebook he barely knows? In this video, we're going to keep returning to this pattern. The show wants the consequences of complexity without the work of building it. Harrison stops being a believable teenager and becomes a device. One scene proves he can be popular. Another proves he can be brutal. Another proves he can be moral. The combination is never actually investigated. Montage it in your head. Harrison pinning a wrestler, Harrison comforting a victim, Harrison flicking open a razor, Harrison nodding along as Dexter explains the code. Does that look like a coherent human being, or a checklist designed to justify what the finale needs him to do next? And that checklist feeling only gets stronger when we put Harrison's code arc next to Dexter's. The contrast is brutal. The original series spends seasons showing us how long it takes to build a monster who believes he's following rules. Let's kick things off with those early flashbacks. Young Dexter in the shipping container. Harry sitting him down after the stray cat incident. The endless ride-alongs where Harry points at case files and crime scenes and repeats the same message. You can't stop the urge, but you can control the damage. It's not a weekend seminar. It's a childhood. A therapy substitute. A years-long investigation into Dexter's psychology that never really works, but at least feels like a process. We watch Dexter fail the code repeatedly before he ever masters it. He stalks the wrong men. He almost gets caught dumping bodies. Brian exploits the gaps Harry left. Dokes reads the pattern in his behavior. Every time Dexter thinks he's finally integrated the rules, reality corrects him. The code is a moving target, and the show lets that learning curve play out across season after season. Now jump to Iron Lake, and the entire thing gets compressed into what feels like a narrative speedrun. In this video, we're going to treat Harrison's conversion like exactly what it is, a plan to recreate the code in fast forward. Dexter gives him the Cliff Notes version in a cabin, with no real groundwork, no trial and error, no years of testing boundaries. Within minutes, Harrison is talking about bad people like he's been sitting in Harry's car since age 8. To keep this clear, go back to the cabin confession. Dexter finally drops the mask. He admits the dark passenger. He reveals the kill rooms, the plastic, the blood. For one brief moment, New Blood touches the horror the original series lived in. Harrison realizes his dad is not a tragic lumberjack, but the Bay Harbor butcher. That should shatter him. That should send the entire father-son fantasy into freefall. Instead, the conversation pivots with whiplash speed. Shock, a few tears, a raised voice, and then, almost immediately, so you only kill bad people? The central question is no longer, how could you? But how can I help? The scene jumps from existential collapse to vigilante internship, like we skipped 3 episodes of psychological fallout. The focus is not just on pacing, it's on what gets lost. In the original run, the code is a flawed survival mechanism. It fails Harry, it fails Deb, it fails Dexter's victims and his family. It never really justifies anything. But in New Blood, that long history of failure gets flattened into a convenient label Harrison can slap on his own rage. What happens when a rulebook that never worked is treated as instant moral clarity? We get a teenager who adopts the language of righteous killing without ever wrestling with the consequences. And the story acts like that's growth, not a warning sign. Along the way, the code stops being a problem to interrogate and becomes a shortcut to the finale. Which raises the next question. If Harrison can convert that fast, how carefully is anyone in Iron Lake actually thinking about who Dexter really is? Which brings us to the one person in Iron Lake who actually tries to think about who Dexter really is. Angela Bishop. On paper, she's the antidote to Harrison's instant conversion. She hesitates, she questions, she investigates. But the more we track her investigation, the more we see the same problem, sharp instinct, wrapped in procedural collapse. Let's kick things off with what the show gets right about her. Angela notices the wrong things in exactly the right way. Jim Lindsay's fake backstory. The way he handles guns, injuries, and crime scenes with a little too much control. The missing girls that no one else connects into a pattern. She listens to Molly's true crime podcast, pulls up an old Miami case file, and actually follows a tiny detail, like a needle mark on Matt Caldwell's corpse, instead of letting it slide. In another season, this is the kind of detective who would have terrified Dexter. To keep this clear, Angela's instincts are not the issue. It's the investigation that's built around them. We watch her confront Dexter again and again, without a real warrant, without a tight chain of custody, without even basic backup. She casually shows Molly evidence. She drags Dexter into the station to grill him like she's already in the finale, then lets him walk back out into the snow. These are not minor technicalities. These are the exact failures that would blow any Bay Harbor butcher case apart the second a defense attorney enters the room. And then there's the leap. One dead rich kid with a needle mark in Iron Lake becomes, in Angela's mind, the missing piece of a legendary Miami serial killer investigation. How? A Parcast episode, a Google search, a blood test from Harrison that somehow pings the exact right database without triggering a full federal swarm we ever see on screen. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that gap between what the story needs to happen and what the evidence actually supports. Here, the gap is massive. The central question isn't whether Angela could, in theory, connect Dexter to Bay Harbor. It's whether she does it in a way that respects the show's own history of forensics and procedure. Where are the subpoenas for Miami records, the coordinated task force, the months of surveillance on a suspected mass murderer? Instead, we jump from your son's Dina matches this dead cop to you are the Bay Harbor butcher, like the intervening work doesn't matter. It's a narrative shortcut masquerading as detective work. Along the way, the focus is not just on Angela catching Dexter, but on how the script keeps her just smart enough to corner him and just sloppy enough to leave every logical hole unpatched. She finds Kurt's bunker, but doesn't lock down every inch. She arrests Dexter, but leaves him in a tiny, understaffed jail. Each major section will keep exposing this pattern. New Blood knows it needs someone to finally end Dexter's trajectory, but it also knows that if Angela followed real procedure, one single piece of evidence would have forced the Miami story wide open long before the finale. And that's the piece we need to look at next. And that one single piece of evidence is where New Blood quietly abandons its own investigation logic. From the moment Angela swabs that burned body in the cave and sends the Dina out, the show treats the result like a magic spell that can collapse 10 years of Dexter's control and bridge 1,000 miles of jurisdiction in a single cut. To keep this clear, let's walk the sequence the way the episode presents it. Angela gets Dina from one of Kurt's victims. She runs it through whatever lab the Iron Lake budget can reach. The report comes back, a match to an unidentified victim in an old Miami case file. One small connection, one stray number on a screen, and suddenly, the Bay Harbor butcher, Miami Metro, and Dexter Morgan are all hovering just off frame. The investigation doesn't build, it jumps. In this video, we're going to keep asking the central question: what would it actually take for that jump to happen? In the real world, a rural chief does not casually ping a national database and get a neatly packaged breadcrumb that just happens to align with a true crime podcast she's been half listening to. There are federal systems, state systems, case-specific databases, and they do not all talk cleanly. You need authorizations, warrants, interagency contacts. You need a reason. And then there's chain of custody. A frozen corpse from Kurt's secret bunker, swabbed in the field, shipped who knows where, somehow lands with enough credibility to reopen one of the most politically radioactive serial killer cases in Florida history. That's not just a stretch. That is a collapse of everything the original series showed us about how carefully the Bay Harbor Butcher files were handled. The focus is not just on realism for its own sake. It's on how the show's own prior world building gets ignored when a shortcut feels easier. Notice what Angela does not have. No financial records tying Jim Lindsay to Miami, no travel logs, ticket stubs, or highway cameras. No digital footprint that bridges Dexter's death and his Iron Lake alias. She doesn't even have a verifiable legal identity for Jim that can be cross-checked against Dexter Morgan. All she has is a hunch, a podcast, and a partial Dina overlap that should, at best, trigger more questions, not immediate certainty. So, why does it play like certainty? Because the plan behind the writing needs Angela to be right. The investigation is reverse engineered from the ending. Each major section will keep showing this pattern. Dexter's downfall is framed as inevitable, but the route the story takes is improbably smooth. By hinging the revelation on a single, almost mystical Dina hit, New Blood trades the slow, grounded detective work of the early seasons for narrative convenience. One lab result stands in for weeks of surveillance, subpoenas, and interdepartmental friction. And along the way, that convenience sets up the next leap. How a podcast about the Bay Harbor butcher and one familiar face from Miami will give Angela the confidence to finally put a real name to Jim Lindsay. Blood trades the slow, grounded detective work of the early seasons for narrative convenience. One lab result stands in for weeks of surveillance, subpoenas, and interdepartmental friction. And along the way, that convenience sets up the next leap. Angela Bishop opening a Parcast app and somehow stumbling into the most classified serial killer investigation in Miami history. We cut from iron-like domesticity to Angela in her kitchen, earbuds in, listening to a true crime breakdown of the Bay Harbor butcher. No clearance, no federal task force, just a podcast queue. From a storytelling angle, it's clean. From an in-universe perspective, it's a collapse of basic realism. This is a case that, in Dexter's original trajectory, shredded careers, triggered internal affairs, and required LaGuerta to risk everything just to whisper her suspicions. Yet here, it's background content between coffee refills. Let's kick things off with the scope of what Angela supposedly accesses. Within an episode or two, she's not just hearing the public legend, she's poring over detailed Miami Metro files, crime scene photos, and internal theories that, in the original series, never went wide. Doak's involvement, the blood slide pattern, the marina searches. Even the notion that the butcher might have been law enforcement, these were tightly held, politically radioactive threads. To keep this clear, we're being asked to believe a small-town chief with no federal mandate and no apparent task force can casually pull documents that once required chain-of-command gymnastics and career suicide. The central question becomes, who is giving her this level of access, and why is there no pushback? No supervisor. No FBI. No, you've tripped a federal flag by opening this file. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that tension between what the show tells us about institutional pressure in Miami and what it forgets when it needs Angela to move the plot. Then, we hit the Batista phone call. A chance encounter at a conference becomes the magic key. Angela shows a photo of Jim Lindsay, Batista's face drops, and suddenly he's recalling Dexter Morgan, the Bay Harbor butcher, and a dead sergeant named Dokes in one neat exposition dump. One conversation, one memory lane, and Angela's entire investigation pivots from my boyfriend might be lying to my boyfriend is one of the most infamous serial killers in modern history. On paper, it's dramatic. In execution, it feels reverse engineered. The focus is not just on Angela's competence, it's on how every beat is designed to resurrect the Bay Harbor butcher mythos, not to emerge organically from her detective work. She doesn't build a case from the ground up. She plugs Dexter into a pre-existing legend until the outline matches. And there's a deeper fracture here. If Batista really remembers Deb's suspicions, LaGuerta's doubts, and the unresolved mess of that season, why is this the first time he's connecting those dots out loud? What else does he know that the show keeps off screen? And why does his memory only sharpen when the script needs a final nail for Dexter's coffin? And that's where Batista's memory problem stops being a detail and starts feeling like a retroactive rewrite. In the original series, his entire trajectory with Dexter is defined by the absence of that kind of clarity. These men drink together, share case files, trade war stories. Batista praises Dexter's instincts, leans on his blood work, and treats him as the quiet, reliable constant in a department full of chaos. Suspicion is Dokes' role. Loyalty is Batista's. Let's kick things off by actually remembering who Batista was in Miami. When LaGuerta starts circling the Bay Harbor butcher, he's cautious, even resistant. He worries about the consequences for the department, for Deb, for the investigation's reputation if she's wrong. He doesn't storm into rooms announcing that Dexter Morgan is a viable serial killer suspect. He tries to manage fallout and maintain control. The code that governs him is institutional, not intuitive paranoia. So when New Blood has him sit in a hotel bar, hear Dexter Morgan and Harrison in the same breath, and suddenly light up like every buried doubt is snapping into place, it feels less like a man connecting long, dormant dots, and more like the script reaching for a shortcut. The central question becomes, where was this version of Batista when it actually mattered? Where was this sharp, retroactive suspicion during the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, or when LaGuerta died under blatantly suspicious circumstances? To keep this clear, think about what the revival asks us to accept. One conversation with Angela. One photo of Jim Lindsay, who looks exactly like Dexter 10 years later. A reminder that Deb once dated a guy who turned out to be a serial killer. Suddenly, Batista is ready to fly to Iron Lake, dig up LaGuerta's old file in his mind, and implicitly endorse the idea that Dexter could be the butcher. No new evidence, no reopened federal investigation, just narrative momentum. Yet, in the original season dealing with Bay Harbor, Batista barely engages with LaGuerta's theory until it's too late. And even then, his focus is on Dokes, on departmental politics, on survival. If he now remembers detailed suspicions about Dexter, why didn't those memories trigger any plan, any off-screen investigation, any quiet follow-up over the intervening decade? Did he really need a true crime podcast and a small-town chief to tell him his best friend's death and his colleague's murder never made sense? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that pattern. People suddenly knowing Dexter is dangerous only after the story needs them to. The focus is not just on Batista's character. It's on how New Blood uses him as external validation for Angela's theory, a human stamp of approval that tells the audience, yes, this adds up, even when the actual logic collapses under scrutiny. Each major section will show another place where continuity bends so the ending can stand, and if Batista's memory can be rewritten this easily. What does that say about every other returning thread the revival pulls on next? If Batista's memory can be bent that far out of shape, the show's next move is to bend geography, architecture, and common sense in the exact same way. Enter Kirk Caldwell's Underground Museum of Nightmares. From the moment we see that smooth, concrete staircase, the humming generators, the glass coffins of frozen victims lit like a gallery opening, we know we're not in Iron Lake anymore. We're in a horror diorama. Let's kick things off with what the bunker actually is. It's underground. It's fully powered. It's climate-controlled with industrial refrigeration, strong enough to preserve human bodies for years without visible decay. There's a central corridor lined with sealed, upright trophies, each woman posed, dressed, and displayed behind glass. At the end, a shrine-like viewing area where Kurt can stand, unbothered by smell, insects, or decomposition, and relive his kills. This is not a shallow grave in the woods. This is a morgue crossed with an art installation. And the central question is, how does a small-town truck stop owner build that? Kurt isn't some shadowy billionaire with offshore shell companies. He's a public-facing businessman, a regular at the diner, a guy whose income stream is diesel, venison, and nostalgia. To keep this clear, what we're being asked to accept is that he quietly excavated a large underground chamber, poured reinforced concrete, installed power, ventilation, and advanced cooling, and then maintained it for years. No permits, no contractors, No supply deliveries anyone remembers. No employee asking why the boss keeps ordering enough insulation and refrigerant to outfit a hospital. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to the gap between what the show wants us to feel and what it actually shows us. Here, the focus is not just on the gruesome imagery, but on the logistics. Where are the truckloads of dirt from the excavation? Where are the noise complaints during construction? In a town that small, where everyone knows who skipped a hunting season. How does nobody notice Kurt's repeated trips to the exact same off-road access point at all hours in all weather? Look at the proximity the series establishes. The bunker is close enough to town that Dexter and Harrison can reach it quickly. It's near Kurt's hunting grounds, near the truck routes he uses to abduct women, and close enough to his legitimate properties that it's functionally part of his daily commute. Every missing person investigation, every search party, every state cop driving through would have been slicing right across those same roads, over years, maybe decades. And yet, no one stumbles on a concealed entrance, fresh tire tracks, or the faint mechanical hum of a subterranean freezer farm. What we're really seeing is a set piece, not an extension of Kurt's psychology or resources. The bunker exists, so the camera can glide past those bodies and deliver a shocking reveal. It's production design standing in for character work. Along the way, the show abandons the grounded investigation logic it used in earlier seasons and replaces it with a haunted house that only appears when the plot needs a climax. And if Kurt's bunker can exist with no consequences, what other shortcuts are hiding under the snow in Iron Lake? If the bunker is a haunted house that only materializes when the plot needs it. Then the real ghost in Iron Lake is statistical reality. Those frozen bodies don't just raise the stakes for Dexter and Harrison. They quietly imply a massacre that the town, the state, and apparently the entire country just shrug off. Let's kick things off with the scale the show accidentally suggests. Wall after wall of embalmed women. Different fashions, different decades, different stages of decomposition. Kurt talks about hunting runaways for years, and the production design backs him up. This isn't 5 or 6 kills. We're looking at dozens at minimum, possibly edging toward a serial trajectory that spans 20 or 30 years. In a town this small, that's not a background detail. That's a generational trauma event. So the central question becomes, how does Iron Lake continue to function as a mildly sleepy, mildly quirky community when that many women vanish along the same basic routes? In this video, we're going to lean on basic probability more than forensic psychology. A handful of disappearances on a major highway can slip under the radar, but once you hit double digits, patterns emerge. Families organize. Journalists connect dots. State police form task forces. The FBI, whose entire plan is to notice cross-jurisdictional anomalies, starts asking why every few years a young woman disappears near this one truck stop, this one diner, this one patch of woods. To keep this clear, the show does gesture at an explanation. These are marginalized victims. Runaways, women without stable homes, without local advocates. Angela's wall of missing girls is supposed to tell us that these cases were scattered, misfiled, dismissed, that the collapse is institutional, not narrative. On paper, that's compelling. It fits with true crime reality, where certain victims don't trigger the same media frenzy. But the focus is not just on who they are. It's on how many there are, how concentrated the geography is, and how long Kurt has been operating without a single large-scale investigation ever brushing up against him. Even if every girl is labeled a runaway, the sheer volume should eventually override that label. A podcast like Molly's, an online community of families, a single retired detective with time on their hands, statistically. someone notices. Yet, New Blood keeps this horror almost entirely self-contained inside Angela's office and Kurt's bunker. The result is that these missing girls function more as atmosphere than as a fully realized crisis. They deepen the mood, they justify Angela's obsession, they give Harrison something righteous to latch onto. But they never reshape Iron Lake the way a real town would be reshaped by decades of predation. No national media vans, no cold case specials, no federal databases pinging on repeat. And that leads us to an even darker implication the show never really confronts. If Kurt can stack trophies for decades with no one asking where the bodies are, then the story quietly assumes a second, equally impossible secret, a perfect disposal system operating right alongside the perfect bunker. How exactly does that work under all this snow? Because that disposal fantasy feeds directly into the show's other big illusion around Kurt, that he can hunt in plain sight at a modern truck stop for decades and leave almost nothing behind. From security cameras watching every pump to credit card readers logging every sale, this is not some backwoods shack. This is a data factory. And yet the investigation treats it like a haunted house no one ever bothered to wire. Let's kick things off with Kurt's basic pattern. He targets vulnerable women drifting through Iron Lake, isolates them at his truck stop, and then somehow moves them from public spaces to private captivity with zero meaningful witnesses. We watch Chloe on camera. We see her at the diner, at the station, under Angela's partial protection. Then, she just evaporates into Kurt's orbit. No clerk remembers a screaming argument. No trucker notices the same old man hovering around runaways every few months. The whole town's psychology collapses into selective blindness so his plan can stay clean. To keep this clear, think about how many digital footprints each victim would generate in 2021. Security footage at the bar, the diner, the gas pumps, license plate readers on nearby roads, ATM cameras, cell phone pings bouncing off every tower in the region. Even a basic missing persons investigation would start triangulating those points, building a trajectory that keeps converging on the same truck stop, the same owner, the same white truck. Yet New Blood acts like Iron Lake is pre-internet, until Angela suddenly needs a Google search to catch Dexter. Look at the specific abductions we actually see. The girl Angela picks up for vagrancy, who then ends up in Kurt's bunker. The way Chloe is literally on police radar, then conveniently slips through every procedural crack. We have officers who know her name, know she's in danger, and know Kurt is lying about putting her on a bus. Where are the ticket records? The station cameras? The bus company logs that would show she never left town? The central question isn't, could Kurt be evil? It's, how does no one ever follow the paperwork? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between what the world of the show pretends technology can't do and what any real investigation would immediately try. The focus is not just on Kurt as a monster, but on the infrastructure that would inevitably close around someone this sloppy, this visible, this ritualistic. Each major section will feel like a case study in institutional failure, and Kurt's reign is Exhibit A. Because once we montage it all together, the cameras never checked, the credit cards never traced, the cell phones never pinged, the truck stop never audited, we see the same pattern Dexter has relied on for years. A universe that only enforces consequences when the plot needs drama. And along the way, that selective enforcement sets up the next collapse, Angela suddenly becoming a forensic bloodhound for Dexter, while remaining mysteriously blind to the serial killer who's been operating in her own jurisdiction all along. And once Angela's selective vision props the plot up, the show doubles down with an even stranger duel, Dexter versus Kurt, a cat and mouse game where both cats forget how to hunt. Let's kick things off with Dexter's investigation. Old Miami Dexter would stalk in the dark, confirm patterns, and only then move. In Iron Lake, he's breaking into Kurt's cabin in broad daylight, sneaking around the truck stop, rifling through office drawers, and casually leaving digital and physical traces. He hacks cameras, walks right into active crime scenes, and keeps orbiting Kurt's property like he's daring the universe to notice. The central question becomes, is this a man obsessed with control, or a script that needs him to be sloppy so Kurt has someone to glare at? From Dexter following Kurt's truck, to spying on him at the diner, to that first illegal cabin entry, the investigation stops feeling like a methodical plan and starts feeling like a teenager sneaking out after curfew. There's no burner phones, no meaningful counter-surveillance, no serious thought to how a rich, connected local might respond. To keep this clear, the failure is not just that Dexter makes mistakes. It's that the show forgets his entire operational psychology from earlier seasons, where every move was about minimizing exposure. On the other side, Kurt abandons subtlety almost immediately. He visits Harrison at school, shows up at the wrestling match, invites him to the diner, and drops cryptic lines about second chances and bad fathers that might as well be written in neon. He sends Harrison money. He stares down Dexter in public, in a small town where everyone knows everyone. How do these theatrically ominous gestures not trigger wider suspicion, or at least a quiet investigation from Angela? Kurt has been killing for years without being caught, yet the moment the plot needs a personal feud, he turns into a serial killer who monologues in broad daylight. The Christmas party is where the cat and mouse dynamic fully breaks. Kurt dancing with Harrison, the tense glances, Angela and Dexter under the same roof while a serial killer works the room. It's staged like a holiday thriller trailer, not a grounded procedural escalation. Then we jump to the cabin sequence. Kurt lures Harrison, sets up a sniper position, leaves evidence, and Dexter charges in like an action hero rather than a ghost. The focus is not just on what happens, but on how every character suddenly behaves as if subtlety is irrelevant. In this video, we're going to keep tracking that trajectory, because this rushed, melodramatic escalation doesn't stop with Kurt's death. The kill room showdown with Harrison, the moral logic Dexter uses to justify taking Kurt out in front of his son, and the consequences that choice unlocks for the finale all expose just how far the series is willing to bend its own rules for one last big confrontation. What happens when the code itself becomes theater? And that question of the code turning into theater hits its most literal form the moment the plastic comes back. We cut from Iron Lake's snow and wood-paneled cabins to a familiar nightmare: clear sheeting, shrink-wrapped walls, tools laid out with surgical pride, trophies pinned up like a traveling exhibit of Dexter's greatest hits. It's the Miami Kill Room, rebooted for a town with one stoplight and maybe 3 viable industrial spaces. In this video, we're going to sit with that image, because it reveals how far the show is willing to bend basic reality just to recreate a ritual. The central question is simple. How does a man who supposedly learned the cost of patterns decide that the best plan in a tiny community is to resurrect the exact pattern that almost got him caught in a major city? This isn't stealth. This is cosplay. Let's kick things off with logistics. To keep this clear, think about what a kill room actually requires. Rolls of plastic, tape, knives, saws, restraints, cleaning agents. In Miami, Dexter could hide materials in a lab, a boat, a random storage container, along miles of anonymous coastline. In Iron Lake, where is Jim Lindsay buying bulk plastic and industrial strength cleaners without someone at the feed store asking why the quiet shop clerk is suddenly building a meth lab? Where is he storing all of this in a cabin that Harrison can wander through at any time. Then, there are the bodies. No ocean, no convenient Gulf Stream to whisk away his mistakes. Yet the show barely pauses to ask how Dexter transports, dismembers, and disposes of full-grown men in a town where everybody recognizes everybody's truck. The Christmas cabin kill of Kurt is framed as a cathartic father-son moment, but look closely. They leave a blood-soaked crime scene in the middle of a snow-blanketed hunting area, with tire tracks, footprints, and trace evidence everywhere. Who plows that road the next morning? Who notices the disturbed snowpack, the missing local billionaire, the smell? The focus is not just on what Dexter does, but on what the camera refuses to show. Blood spatter that used to be an entire sub-discipline of the series becomes a red filter and a cutaway. No hair, no fibers, no transfer on Dexter's winter clothes. We never see him laundering, bleaching, burning. The investigation that once turned his own blood slides into a noose is replaced by an almost magical off-screen disposal process, as if the dark passenger now comes with a built-in housekeeping service. Along the way, the ritual itself stops feeling like a compulsion and starts feeling like fan service. Jim Lindsay is supposed to be the version of Dexter who finally respects how fragile his control really is. Yet, every time he tapes up another room, he's announcing, to us and to the universe, that he learned nothing from the Bay Harbor Butcher. If the whole Iron Lake trajectory is about a man trying to disappear, why is he staging encore performances of his most traceable behavior? That contradiction sets up the next collapse, when the town, and Angela in particular, start noticing the seams in the fantasy he's built. Iron Lake only works as Dexter's hideout if the town forgets how evidence works. As soon as he tapes up another room, the series quietly has to erase the kind of basic forensic follow-through that shredded his life in Miami. Let's kick things off with what Dexter is actually leaving behind. We see fibers from his clothes and gloves brushing against plastic and wood. We see tool marks from his knives, his saw, his restraints carving the same signatures into different locations. We see tire tracks from his truck and Kurt's cabin run, and repeated digital traces every time Jim Lindsay buys supplies, clocks in at the store, or drives past cameras on those endless, snow-covered roads. In a post-Bay Harbor Butcher world, how does none of this trigger a serious investigation? Bodies surface under blatantly suspicious circumstances. Matt's deer hunting accident has a missing corpse, a blood trail, and a witness who keeps changing his story. The burnt cabin, where Kurt tries to erase evidence, contains remains, accelerant, and a clear connection to multiple missing women. Molly Park disappears after last being seen in Iron Lake, in the orbit of both Kurt and Dexter. Each of these should be a magnet for state police, lab techs, and federal databases. Instead, the show treats them like narrative speed bumps we glide over. To keep this clear, the central question is not whether Angela is smart. The focus is not just on her pattern recognition, which is actually sharp. She links Dexter to the needle marks on Miles, connects the screwed-up ketamine detail to Miami, and listens to Molly's podcast in a way no one in Miami ever listened to their own evidence. The problem is that her competence is wildly selective. She jumps from a partial Dina hit on Angela Bishop to Dexter Morgan is the Bay Harbor Butcher, with almost no depiction of state-level verification, interagency calls, or a real chain of custody. We never see her send Iron Lake evidence to a regional lab for fiber analysis. We never see tire impressions from the Kurt cabin night matched to Dexter's truck. We never see digital forensics on Molly's devices, or Harrison's phone, or the cameras around town that should track Jim's movements during every kill. It's as if the entire infrastructure that once made Dexter's job dangerous has been unplugged. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this idea of structural collapse. Iron Lake functions as a forensic black hole by design. Evidence goes in. Nothing comes out. That lets the plot move fast, lets Dexter keep killing, and lets Angela solve the case through intuition and podcast lore, instead of the grinding procedure that once boxed him in. And yet, there is one crime scene in New Blood that finally resists that gravity. One set of traces that refuses to disappear and points straight back at Dexter. That's where the illusion of safety in Iron Lake really breaks, and where the consequences start to feel inescapable again. And that one crime scene is not Kurt's bunker or some elaborate tableau. It's Dexter's own life in Iron Lake, finally leaving a trail that even this underwritten investigation can't ignore. From the burned cabin to the needle marks to the suspicious traffic stop. The show decides everything converges at once, and suddenly, everyone we've been watching changes overnight to make the convergence work. Let's kick things off with Dexter himself. For 9 episodes, he's the careful predator in exile, obsessed with control, ritual, and staying off the grid. He paces his kills, hides behind Jim Lindsay, and treats exposure as the one failure he cannot afford. Then, Angela closes in with a few shaky pieces of evidence, and instantly his entire psychology lurches from stealth to sprint. The moment she arrests him, the plan is no longer to outthink the investigation. It's to break procedure, stab Logan, and bolt for the woods like a cornered amateur. These are not minor adjustments. These are a collapse. Throughout his life, Dexter has adapted under pressure, but he has rarely abandoned the code so fast that he kills an innocent cop as a stepping stone. The central question becomes, are we watching Dexter finally strip down to raw survival instinct, or are we watching the writers shove him toward a death sentence on a timetable? The trajectory from meticulous hunter to desperate escape artist happens in a single morning, with almost no internal struggle shown. Harrison's arc bends just as sharply. A few scenes earlier, he's thrilled by the idea that his father has a code, that the darkness can be organized into a plan with rules and targets. He helps on Kurt's kill, listens to the Bay Harbor Butcher podcast, and nods along as vigilantism is framed as justice. Then, with almost no new information beyond Logan's death and a clearer glimpse at the body count, he flips from awe to horror in minutes. Why now? Why this line after watching Kurt's trophy room and hearing about Miami for days? To keep this clear, the focus is not just on his moral revulsion, which is valid. It's on the speed. Harrison doesn't slowly unravel the myth. He just suddenly sees Dexter as a monster, because the finale needs a gun pointed at the protagonist. The investigation of the code, the psychology of inheriting violence, gets compressed into a single snow-covered standoff. Meanwhile, Angela, who has juggled her feelings, her duty, and some very flexible police work all season, snaps from conflicted partner to pure moral arbiter. She bypasses backup, cuts corners on evidence, and yet speaks with the absolute certainty of a judge, jury, and historian of the Bay Harbor Butcher. Each major section will of her character up to now, mother, small-town cop, compromised investigator, is swept aside so she can deliver the final verdict. Along the way, these rushed turns don't just enable Dexter's death, they manufacture it. The world suddenly aligns to remove every off-ramp, every alternative, every slower, messier legal consequence. And that raises the question we have to confront next. If this ending was inevitable, why does it only become possible through a final escape plan that barely makes sense on its own terms? So let's kick things off with the paradox at the heart of the finale. The world's most careful killer dies because, in the span of one morning, he forgets how to be careful. From a holding cell to a snow-covered clearing, Dexter's last plan doesn't feel like a collapse of control we've been tracking for 10 seasons. It feels like someone flipped a switch labeled Endgame. Once Angela arrests him, the central question should be, what would Dexter Morgan actually do here? He has options. He could lean into a legal defense, exploit the thin chain of evidence, argue contamination on the Dina, and let the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation drag into procedural mud. He could flee alone, abandoning Harrison to protect him, the way he once abandoned Hannah and Harrison in Argentina. He could weaponize Kurt's bunker and confession videos, cut a deal that turns the Iron Lake investigation outward. Instead, the show narrows everything to one binary: confess fully or bolt violently. To keep this clear, most of the realistic, character, consistent paths are simply never put on the table. That narrowing leads to the Logan moment, which is where the psychology of Dexter's code really breaks. For years, the rule has been simple: don't kill the innocent. He walks away from Dokes in the cabin. He spares Quinn. He spends an entire season wrestling with whether Deb's blood is on his hands. Yet, in New Blood, he snaps Logan's neck in a split-second decision because he needs a gun and a key. No contingency plan. No attempt to manipulate. No non-lethal move. Just a blunt, sloppy execution of a man who has done nothing but try to help Harrison and keep the town safe. If Dexter can casually violate the core safeguard Harry drilled into him, what was the point of seasons of agonized restraint? And that crack carries straight into the confrontation with Harrison. We move from a chaotic escape to a roadside standoff almost instantly. Dexter's justification is familiar. Logan's death was necessary. The code still applies. They will run and start over. The plan can be salvaged if they act now. Harrison's objection is equally clear. If the code allows killing Logan, then the code is rotten. But watch how fast it escalates. There is almost no space for negotiation, no serious attempt by Dexter to disarm his son emotionally or physically, no version of the scene where he surrenders and faces the consequences he's been outrunning since season 1. It's kill or be killed in minutes, because the script needs a body. In this video, we're going to argue that this isn't the inevitable end of Dexter's trajectory. It's a writer's room mandate executed by making him suddenly bad at being Dexter. The focus is not just on the death itself, but on how every safeguard, every habit of control, every prior pattern of self-preservation is suspended for convenience. Along the way, that raises one more question we have to tackle next. If the finale breaks Dexter to end him, what does that do to the entire story we just watched? From a rifle butt cracking into Matt Caldwell's skull, to a body dragged through fresh snow, to a hastily wiped cabin floor under fluorescent police lights, this is not a perfect kill. This is Dexter's worst operational nightmare, an impulsive murder, in public, with half the town as potential witnesses to the buildup. Let's kick things off by reconstructing that night. Dexter's plan, if we can even call it that, collapses the moment he abandons stalking for a face-to-face confrontation at the gun shop. We watch him argue with Matt, get visibly angry, and then follow him out to the woods where everyone knows they're hunting. No code. No cooling off period. No anonymous Miami alleyway. Just Jim Lindsay, the quiet store clerk, suddenly entangled with the most hated rich kid in Iron Lake. The central question is simple. How does this not detonate his cover immediately? At the cabin, Dexter shoots Matt at close range. There is blood spatter on the plastic, on the floor, on Dexter himself. Ballistics would show an execution-style shot, not an accidental hunting misfire. The body disappears, leaving drag patterns in the snow and a crime scene that screams staged. Yet the official response is basically, guess Matt ran off again. The investigation behaves as if this is a routine missing persons case until the season needs pressure. To keep this clear, look at what any competent small-town department would see. Motive, public conflict over the deer, with multiple people watching Dexter and Matt clash. Opportunity, Dexter is one of the last people to see him alive and has no solid alibi for the critical window. Behavior, the man who's been pathologically calm for 10 years suddenly looks rattled, hyper-involved, and very interested in how the search is going. How is he not, at minimum, on Angela's short list from day one? Instead, the show grants Dexter an almost magical leniency. Angela shrugs off his proximity. Logan jokes about Matt being a screw-up and moves on. Even when the blood on the snow and the thermal drone footage suggest something went very wrong, suspicion diffuses into the ether. The focus is not just on what the investigation misses, but on how the script keeps redirecting attention away from the obvious suspect standing in the middle of every scene. Along the way, this early plot hole sets a pattern for New Blood's entire trajectory. Dexter's plans are visibly fraying. He's sloppier with evidence, more reckless with witnesses, more emotionally volatile around Harrison. Yet instead of real consequences, we get contrived blind spots, delayed realizations, and a town that only becomes genre-savvy when the season order demands it. If Matt's death is this messy, and Dexter still walks, what does that say about every crime scene that follows? If Matt's death can vanish under a pile of narrative blind spots, Harrison's campfire confession is where the show stops even pretending to care about basic internal logic. We move from no one's connecting the dots to the dots literally don't exist, but everyone applauds anyway. And the central question becomes, whose reality are we living in now? Harrison's, or the one we watched for 8 seasons? Let's kick things off with the monologue itself. Flames flickering, faces turned toward him, Harrison spins this harrowing memory of Rita's murder. He talks about blood, about the bathtub, about his mother's body, in a way that implies a vivid, cinematic recall. It's detailed. It's emotionally textured. It's delivered like a trauma he has replayed for years. But to keep this clear, Harrison was a baby. In the original investigation, he's literally found sitting in blood, not forming episodic memories, not building a coherent narrative of that night. So what are we watching? From a psychology standpoint, the only way this works is if Harrison is reconstructing a story from things he's been told or things he's imagined. That would actually be fascinating. A kid raised in the long shadow of a crime scene, haunted by photographs, secondhand accounts, and Dexter's silence. But New Blood never frames it that way. The camera language, the music, the reactions all treat his words as direct access to a buried memory, not a retconned myth. And no one pushes back. Not one adult at that fire, not one parent, not one person who has ever read a basic article on childhood trauma says, wait, how do you remember that? Most damningly, Angela doesn't. Angela, who's dating Jim, who's a cop, who is actively running an investigation into missing girls, just absorbs this impossible speech as pure, unfiltered truth. If she's sharp enough to leap from a podcast and a Miami case file to Bay Harbor Butcher, why doesn't this set off any alarms? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this pattern. When emotional payoff appears, procedural sense collapses. The focus is not just on Harrison lying or exaggerating. It's on the way the entire town, and by extension the show, weaponizes that unchallenged narrative. The campfire scene isn't about investigation or evidence. It's about manufacturing instant belonging. Harrison bleeds in public, the crowd embraces him, and the writers quietly invite us to overwrite everything we know about his developmental timeline. This is a plan, just not Dexter's. It's the show's plan to fast-track Harrison as the damaged heir to the trauma throne. Once this impossible story slides by unexamined, we've crossed a line. Emotional beats now outrank continuity. Pathos outranks plausibility. From here on, whenever Harrison talks about his darkness, the code, or what he remembers, we're no longer on stable ground. Along the way, that instability will only grow. This won't be the last time Harrison's words rewrite reality, especially once he starts embracing Dexter's code with whiplash speed and the entire moral trajectory of the season bends to fit his latest confession. That instability hits a breaking point the moment Harrison steps onto the wrestling mat, in front of an entire town, under bright lights and rolling cameras. New Blood stages what should be an unignorable crisis, and then treats it like a character-building pep rally. Let's kick things off by replaying that match. Harrison doesn't just win aggressively. He isolates the arm, cranks past the whistle, and keeps going while the other kid screams, and the crowd shifts from hype to horror. The camera lingers on his face. This is not a split-second accident. It reads as premeditated, almost sadistic, like he's testing how far he can go before someone pulls him off. In a show obsessed with the dark passenger, the imagery is deliberate. The question is, where are the consequences? Because in any grounded world, this is a legal and psychological tripwire. We're talking a gym full of witnesses, cell phone videos, school cameras, a clear pattern of intentional harm. To keep this clear, the realistic chain of events is simple. Immediate disqualification, mandatory suspension, a school investigation into violent conduct, at least one mandated psychological evaluation, especially for a transfer student with a vague history. And in a small town where everyone knows everyone, parents would be demanding police involvement. That's the plan the real world would follow. Instead, Iron Lake reacts like Harrison just scored the game-winning touchdown. He walks the halls as a minor celebrity. The injured kid's suffering is background noise, while Harrison gets a mix of hero worship, awkward admiration, and only the faintest hint of "is he okay?" from adults. The focus is not just on the brutality of the move, but on how the script reframes it as a narrative shortcut, proof that he's like Dexter, without paying the price that proof would actually carry. And Dexter's proximity makes the collapse of plausibility even sharper. A cop's boyfriend's son nearly cripples a classmate, and Angela's entire law enforcement apparatus barely blinks. No formal report that we see, no deeper investigation into Harrison's past, despite obvious red flags and Dexter already lying about his identity. If you're a police chief who later manages to connect Dexter to the Bay Harbor Butcher on a podcast and a partial Dina match, how do you not at least pull this kid's records after that match? How is this not the moment the investigation truly starts? Here's where the psychology and the plotting fuse. The wrestling incident becomes narrative shorthand in this video. We're going to call it the wrestling match miracle. One violent outburst is asked to do everything. It signals Harrison's darkness, accelerates his acceptance of the code, and justifies Dexter seeing him as a trainee, all while bypassing the systems that would normally restrain, diagnose, or at least slow that trajectory. Imagine a mini montage split screen. On one side, real life, school board meetings, angry parents, legal threats, mandated therapy, Angela quietly running Harrison through every database she has. On the other, Iron Lake reality, applause, edgy whispers about his temper, Dexter reading it as destiny. We cut right as we ask, what should Angela have done next? And why does the show keep handing her perfect red flags, only to look away? So when Harrison actually vanishes, the show finally has its moment, right? All those red flags, all that tension in a frozen, isolated town. This is where the investigation machine should roar to life. Instead, we watch it idle and neutral while Dexter drives around in his truck, and the script quietly reframes a crisis as a teachable parenting moment. Let's kick things off by naming the stakes the episode refuses to say out loud. We're not dealing with a random angsty teenager sneaking out for a night. We're dealing with a traumatized kid who just survived a school massacre, who carries visible scars, who has a documented history of violence in a community already rattled by unexplained deaths and disappearances. It's the dead of winter, sub-zero temperatures, ice on the roads, predators in the woods. A missing Harrison isn't just a family drama, it's a full-blown public safety emergency. To keep this clear, think about what would actually happen. A police chief learns that the son of her boyfriend, who was present at a violent incident, has run away after a major emotional breakdown. Weather conditions are lethal. The town already suspects something is off with both father and son. In any realistic jurisdiction, that's Amber Alert territory. Patrol cars broadcasting his description. Coordinated search parties on snowmobiles and on foot. Digital tracking of his phone, his social media, his last card transactions. State police notified. Neighboring departments looped in. Angela, specifically, would be on the radio, in the command center, and out in the field, because the consequences of failure here are obvious. A dead teenager on her watch. Now contrast that with what we actually see. Dexter alone in his truck, scanning empty roads. A few concerned faces at the truck stop. No roadblocks. No command post. No search grid maps taped to the walls. No volunteers combing the tree line. No mention of pinging a cell tower or checking bus stations. The central question hangs there. Where is the town that was supposedly so tight-knit and so on edge 2 scenes ago? The focus is not just on what the show skips, but on how quickly it collapses the crisis into a narrative device to engineer that father-son heart-to-heart by the side of the road. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this pattern, because it's not just a missed realism beat, it's structural. Every time external systems could exert real pressure on Dexter's plan to stay hidden or on Harrison's psychological trajectory, the story quietly turns the volume down. No Amber Alert means no paper trail. No multi-agency search means no outside eyes on Dexter's alias, his hunting habits, his past. Iron Lake's institutions stay small and strangely sleepy, so the only forces that matter are Dexter's code and his private conversations. Along the way, that underreaction becomes rehearsal for an even bigger leap. If the town can shrug off a missing, dangerous teenager in a blizzard, what will it do when Angela decides she's found the Bay Harbor butcher living under its nose? Those major red flags getting downgraded to background noise will matter a lot when we watch her build that case on almost nothing, and the show expects us to believe it. And nowhere does that background noise get louder than under Kurt Caldwell's feet. Let's kick things off with the image the show clearly loves. A lonely hunting cabin, snow piling against the walls, a jukebox humming in the dark. Then a hidden elevator in the back room, humming down into a concrete bunker lit like a museum. Bodies posed behind glass, clothes pristine, makeup intact, every victim frozen at the exact moment of terror. This is not a messy kill shed. This is an underground cathedral to control. To keep this clear, the ritual itself is elaborate. Kurt stalks runaways, isolates them, walks them into his cabin at gunpoint, coerces them to run, then shoots them from a distance. He processes the bodies, embalms them, dresses them, applies cosmetics, and seals them upright in climate-controlled cases. That is time. That is equipment. That is chemical supply chains, power usage, ventilation, and waste disposal. in a tiny town, under a man who also runs a truck stop, a diner, and an entire social persona. In this video, we're going to treat that bunker the way Iron Lake never does, like a crime scene with a paper trail. Who poured the concrete? Who installed the hydraulic elevator? Who wired the lighting, the temperature control, the security systems? Are we meant to believe Kurt, a guy constantly visible at the bar and at town events, personally dug and finished a multi-room underground facility with no contractor, no deliveries, no noise complaints? At what point does this stop being a secret and start being a building permit problem? Walk through it slowly, as if we're the investigation team Angela never gets. We step off the elevator. There's a polished hallway, sealed doors, perfectly aligned display windows. Each body is preserved far beyond what amateur methods would allow. There are no signs of decomposition, no insect activity, no power failures. That means redundancy. Backup generators. Regular maintenance. Chemical restocking. Who else should have seen this long before Dexter and Harrison stroll in with a rifle and a flashlight? Then there's the missing persons pattern. Young women vanish around Iron Lake for years. Not tourists in a major city, not anonymous faces in Miami. We're talking a small rural population where every extra car at the diner gets noticed. The central question is, how many disappearances can you stack before even lazy policing, or a state agency, or a bored local reporter starts connecting the trajectory? Runaways, waitresses, drifters, all last seen near Kurt's businesses, and no one ever cross-references that. The focus is not just on logistics, but on psychology and consequences. The bunker is framed as proof of Kurt's meticulous plan, his need for control, his monstrous devotion. But the more we examine it, the more it looks like a horror set piece dropped in from another show. It doesn't extend naturally from the town's reality, or from the kind of predator Iron Lake has actually been willing to ignore. And that weakens him. A villain whose operation could never plausibly exist undercuts the threat he's supposed to represent, and by extension, the weight of Dexter's choice to kill him. Along the way, that disconnect also lets the writers inflate Angela's later investigation without earning it. If this town can miss a subterranean mausoleum and a decade-long pattern of vanishing women, what does it even mean when it suddenly sees the Bay Harbor butcher hiding in plain sight? If Iron Lake can collectively miss a serial killer cave system, it also has to miss the highway feeder system that keeps it stocked. And that's where Kurt's entire operation starts to unravel the second we zoom out from the creepy lighting and actually look at the logistics. Let's kick things off with his basic plan. Night after night, season after season, Kurt cruises the same truck stop. He walks up to women who are visibly stranded, angry, scared, or just trying to get through a shift. Minimal disguise. No fake beard, no altered walk, no different cars. He offers them a place to stay, drives them directly to his property, and then funnels them through the exact same ritualized corridor of terror. The same cabin, the same basement hallway, the same kill room with the same rifle, and the same glass coffin outcome. On a purely psychological level, we understand what the writers are going for. Old school roadside predator, the kind of guy who could have operated in the 70s with nothing but a truck, a lie, and a back road. The focus is not just on the kill, but on the performance, the chase, the scream, the immaculate preservation. But New Blood doesn't live in the 70s. It lives in a world of cameras, phones, and permanent data. To keep this clear, picture that truck stop in real life. Security cameras on the pumps, cameras over the register, exterior CCTV watching the lot, license plate readers on nearby patrol cars pinging every vehicle that comes and goes. Every one of Kurt's approaches would leave a digital shadow. His face on video, his plates in a database. A consistent timestamp pattern tying his presence to women who later vanish. And that's before we even touch the phones. Even transient victims usually have a device that pings towers, logs text threads, and autosaves photos. A hitchhiker posts one last Instagram story from that Iron Lake stop. A runaway texts a friend, "This older guy is giving me a ride. He owns a diner." The central question becomes, how many times can that exact same constellation of data cluster around the same man before a state-level investigation notices? Because Kurt isn't a drifter. He's a prominent local figure. He owns a business. He sponsors the wrestling team. He's on first-name terms with cops, hunters, and town officials. His truck, his face, his routine are all hyper-visible. Even if the formal investigation is lazy, rumor should do the work for free. "Don't get in Kurt's truck" should be urban legend by year 2. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between the aesthetic the show wants and the reality it's pretending to inhabit. Here, the aesthetic wins. We get the haunting image of frozen trophies underground, but the infrastructure that would actually expose him is hand-waved into oblivion. And along the way, there's one victim in particular whose disappearance, in a world with cameras and cell towers, should have blown Kurt's cover wide open. We'll come back to her, because when we line up her last known movements, the whole illusion of control around Iron Lake's invisible predator completely collapses. And that illusion doesn't just collapse around Kurt. It collapses around the investigation itself. The moment the script decides Angela needs to catch up with 15 years of Dexter lore in about 5 minutes of screen time. Let's kick things off with the triggering moment in that bar with Batista. It should feel like a seismic crossover, the past crashing into the present. Instead, we get an offhand recollection. A cop from Miami casually mentions a colleague named Dexter with a son named Harrison, a tragic death, and the Bay Harbor butcher case that never really closed in anyone's mind. One stray detail, one coincidence. And suddenly, Iron Lake is psychically tethered to Miami, as if the universe just connected the red string for her. From there, the show hits fast forward. We cut to Angela's research montage, the kind of compressed investigation that works in a heist movie but breaks the internal logic of a crime story. A few Google searches. A Parcast episode. An old article about a blood expert who died in a hurricane right as the butcher vanished. On screen, we watch her eyes widen, the music swell, the cursor hover over Dexter's name. The central question is, are we watching a detective follow a trail, or a writer dragging her to a predetermined answer? To keep this clear, think about what never happens. Angela doesn't methodically cross-check timelines between Miami Metro's case files and Dexter's supposed death. She doesn't pick up the phone to call federal agencies who spent an entire season of the original show obsessing over the Bay Harbor butcher. There's no formal request for Miami Metro records, no interdepartmental task force. No scene where she has to justify treating a friendly hunting store clerk as a legacy serial killer with a confirmed body count in the dozens. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that gap between what a real investigation would demand and what the narrative needs right now. Because this revelation could have been the spine of New Blood. Imagine a slow-burn, multi-episode arc where Angela quietly tests Dexter's story, pulls Harrison's school records, notices the matching trauma patterns, and then gradually aligns those with the Bay Harbor butcher profile. Each major section will show her assembling fragments, boat registrations, missing offenders, inconsistencies in Dexter's Jim Lindsay identity. Instead, the show compresses all of that potential into a few scenes so we can sprint to the finale's moral showdown. It's not that Angela's conclusion is impossible. It's that the plan to expose Dexter abandons procedure, psychology, and basic evidentiary control in favor of a narrative epiphany. And along the way, we're left with a haunting problem. Even if Angela is right about who Dexter really is, does she ever get the kind of evidence that would hold up in court? Or is this entire case against the Bay Harbor Butcher rebuilt on vibes, shortcuts, and one very convenient conversation? So let's kick things off by laying out what Angela actually has when she finally decides Dexter isn't Jim Lindsay, friendly hunting guide, but the Bay Harbor Butcher in exile. On paper, it sounds strong. Multiple Iron Lake victims with needle marks, ketamine in their systems, a pattern of bodies tied to Dexter's proximity, and that incriminating Miami file about the anesthetic used in the Bay Harbor killings. Add in the glove with Dexter's Dina in her evidence box and Harrison's story about the injection, and it feels, at first glance, like the investigation has cracked wide open. But the central question isn't, is Dexter guilty? It's, can any of this survive an actual courtroom? And that's where the whole plan collapses. Because once we shift from narrative psychology to legal procedure, Angela's case stops looking like a meticulous build and starts looking like a house of cards assembled out of shortcuts, personal vendettas, and contaminated evidence. To keep this clear, look at the chain of custody problems alone. Angela pulls the Miami file through a podcast lead, not a coordinated federal inquiry. She confronts Dexter in his cabin without a proper search warrant, mixes emotional confrontations with evidence collection, and lets her prior relationship with him bleed into every decision. The glove with his Dina? It's discovered after an arson scene, after multiple people have been in and out, and after Angela has already decided Dexter is dangerous. Any competent defense attorney is going to ask, who handled it, when, and under what documented protocol? Then there's the ketamine issue, the show's biggest self-inflicted wound. In the original series, Dexter uses M99, an animal tranquilizer, as his signature knockout drug. New Blood retcons that into ketamine as if the two are interchangeable, and then tries to weld Iron Lake's ketamine victims to the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation. Pharmacologically, procedurally, and historically, that's a mess. A defense lawyer only has to put a toxicologist on the stand and ask one simple question. If the foundational Miami profile is wrong about the drug, how many other assumptions in this code-obsessed narrative are wrong too? Even if we grant that Angela is morally correct, that she's the only one in the entire season willing to see past Dexter's fade, the legal case remains fatally weak. Her leap from one Miami file and a podcast to Dexter is the Bay Harbor Butcher, bypasses the kind of multi-agency review that would normally swarm a potential serial killer unmasked after a decade. No full federal follow-up, no independent retesting, no clean evidentiary trajectory. In this video, we're going to keep returning to that gap between what feels like justice and what would actually hold up under pressure. Imagine a courtroom, Angela on the stand, the defense walking through every broken chain of custody link, every ketamine inconsistency, every personal bias. How long before reasonable doubt floods the room? We'll leave that verdict hanging for a moment, and along the way, we'll see how the finale leans on that legal fragility to justify a very different kind of ending. Because that legal fragility only matters if the system actually engages. And that brings us to the cabin. To keep this clear, this is the night Dexter's entire Iron Lake plan should have detonated in public. Instead, the show burns the evidence and, somehow, the consequences. Let's kick things off by reconstructing the trajectory of that night. Snow crunching under tires, headlights cutting through the trees. Dexter and Harrison drive to Kurt's remote property like they're running a controlled operation, confront the predator, confirm the victims, erase the threat. They infiltrate the lair, descend into the bunker, and find the trophy room, a glass and formaldehyde mausoleum of missing women, meticulously preserved. Then, the confrontation upstairs. The Christmas lights, the rifle, the kill. Finally, the accelerant, the match, the cabin going up in an inferno that's supposed to cleanse everything. On screen, it plays as catharsis. In any plausible investigation, it's a forensic goldmine. Burn patterns would map where the fire started and how fast it moved. Accelerant residues in the floorboards, on Dexter's clothes, in the snow where he splashed it. Tire tracks from Dexter's truck and Kurt's vehicles, preserved in frozen ground. Footprints from at least 3 people in and out of that cabin, some overlapping, some leading directly from the bunker entrance to the burn site. This is not a neat erasure. This is a messy overlay of movement, intent, and panic. And that's before we touch digital traces. Phone pings placing Dexter and Harrison out at Kurt's property. Security cameras in town catching them leaving, returning, fueling up, banking records for the gas cans. Any halfway competent state fire marshal or federal agent would start building a timeline. Who had motive? Who had access? Who was on that land the night a serial killer's shrine turned into a mass grave? So the central question is, where's that investigation? A powerful local man's cabin is torched. A secret underground bunker full of bodies is discovered. We're talking multiple states worth of missing persons suddenly converging in one concrete room. Yet Dexter and Harrison endure, at best, a brief wave of suspicion and a few tense conversations. No multi-agency task force, no FBI profilers walking the site, no media trucks parked outside Angela Station for weeks. Use a beat-by-beat breakdown of what a real arson and mass grave investigation would look like. Then cut just as we ask, where does Dexter's name show up in that paperwork? In this video, we're going to keep returning to that gap between scale and response. The focus is not just on Kurt's horror, but on how the show bends procedure to preserve its small-town vibe. Because this should have been the moment Iron Lake collapsed under national scrutiny. Instead, the story shrinks. And along the way, that shrinking lets Dexter slip through cracks that, by all rights, should have closed on him forever. Next, we need to look at how the town itself absorbs, or refuses to absorb, what it just learned about monsters in its own backyard. Iron Lake doesn't just absorb the revelation of Kurt's kill bunker. It absorbs Harrison, too, and this is where the psychology really starts to bend under the weight of the finale's plan. From the moment Harrison slices that bully's leg open at wrestling practice, to the way his eyes light up hearing about the code, the show frames him as already leaning toward Dexter's world. He bonds with Dexter over shared nightmares, shared blood, shared rage. He listens to the code, repeats it back, and within an episode, he's helping stalk Kurt, luring him, and standing in a plastic-wrapped cabin while his father dismembers a serial killer on Christmas. There is almost no hesitation, no vomiting, no breakdown, just a disturbed calm, a grim acceptance, and a willingness to help clean up a blood-soaked crime scene like it's a father-son project. To keep this clear, the focus is not just on what Harrison sees, but on how quickly he adjusts. He watches Kurt's body on the table. He walks through the underground trophy room filled with frozen women. He hears Dexter justify every slice as justice. And the central question becomes, what does that do to a teenager's moral trajectory in a matter of hours? According to New Blood, it turns him into Dexter's eager apprentice overnight. Then, the finale hits the brakes so hard the entire arc whiplashes. one accidental kill of Logan during Dexter's escape, and suddenly Harrison is recoiling like he's never crossed a line in his life. He calls Logan an innocent, treats Dexter as if this is some unprecedented moral collapse, and positions himself as the voice of law and order morality. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that pivot, because it is the single most jarring reversal in the season. We go from a kid who was ready to embrace vigilante murder to a kid who sounds like Angela's internal affairs officer. Hours earlier, he's aiming a rifle at Kurt, nodding along to the code. Now he's summarizing the entire Bay Harbor Butcher investigation in a snow-covered clearing, declaring that Dexter's pattern of killing makes him irredeemable. Where did this sudden ethical clarity come from? Therapy we never saw? A legal education off-screen? Along the way, the writers clearly want Harrison to occupy two incompatible roles. He has to be the heir to Dexter's legacy, the living proof that the dark passenger is hereditary. And he has to be the one who ends that legacy, the righteous executioner who pulls the trigger and frees Iron Lake from the monster in flannel. Each major section will gesture at his trauma, his confusion, his anger, but the psychology never catches up to the consequences the plot needs. So we're left with a finale that collapses Harrison's complexity into a single, convenient moment. Is Harrison horrified by Dexter, or by the realization that he's too much like him? Then hold that thought for the final sections, and nowhere is that question sharper than in the moment Dexter kills Logan. We go from a messy, interesting father-son crisis to a single, blunt instrument, one dead cop on a concrete floor, framed as the moral cliff Harrison can't step over. To keep this clear, we have to walk through the jail escape not as the show presents it, but as a decision tree Dexter would have mapped in any other season. Dexter is cuffed in a holding cell. Logan is outside the bars, gun drawn, emotionally charged, but still trying to do his job. Dexter wants one thing: reach Harrison before Angela locks in the Bay Harbor Butcher narrative. In this video, we're going to slow that down. What are his options? He can stall and keep talking. He can feign a panic attack and draw Logan in under medical pretense. He can use his knowledge of procedure to demand a lawyer, a transfer, anything that buys time. Instead, he provokes a close-quarters struggle with a trained officer whose finger is on the trigger. That's not just risky, that's reckless in a way that breaks the internal logic of Dexter's whole trajectory. Think about classic Dexter. Season 2, trapped by Dokes in the cabin, with the entire Bay Harbor Butcher investigation closing in. He drugs Dokes, considers killing him, and still keeps searching for a workaround until Leela removes the choice. Season 4, with Lundy, Deb, Trinity, the stakes are astronomical, and yet Dexter bends over backwards not to kill law enforcement, not to spill innocent blood unless every other plan has collapsed. The code is a rationalization, yes, but it's also a design constraint. It forces him to prioritize control over impulse. With Logan, there is no meticulous plan, no layered contingency, just a quick lunge, a snapped neck, a gunshot that feels like the script firing itself in the foot. The scene is staged as fast and chaotic, almost an accident. Logan's gun goes off, the bullet ricochets, Dexter reacts on instinct. But then the narrative immediately treats it as if Dexter calmly chose to execute a good man in cold blood. Harrison certainly reads it that way, and the finale needs him to. The central question isn't whether Dexter can make a mistake. It's why this mistake has to be so blunt, so out of sync with his established psychology. The focus is not just on Logan dying, but on how many non-lethal exits the script has to ignore to get us there. No taser, no backup, no body cams, no standard small-town procedure that would complicate this clean moral break. Each major section will show New Blood doing this, but Logan's death is the purest example. The show sacrifices Dexter's intelligence, his restraint, even the basic logic of an investigation, to manufacture a single, undeniable sin Harrison can't rationalize away. We freeze on that image: Logan's body, Dexter stepping over him, Harrison watching the last illusion of the code collapse. Is this really the only way the writers could think to end Dexter Morgan? Hold that frame, because next we need to track how the finale doubles down on that choice and turns one contrived death into a permanent, irreversible endpoint. So we freeze on Logan's body, Dexter stepping over him, Harrison watching. Then we jump into the snow, into that final standoff, where the show suddenly decides Dexter is ready to confess everything and die. The central question is, does that choice grow out of the psychology we've been tracking for 8 seasons and New Blood, or did the writers just need an ending? To keep this clear, we have to rewind through Dexter's own internal logic. From season 1, he isn't just a mindless predator. He's a man who builds a plan, a ritual, a code, stalk the target, confirm the victims, prepare the kill room, leave no evidence. He tells himself the code channels the monster into something necessary. He builds a life with Rita, then Hannah, then this quiet Iron Lake identity, because he believes he can manage the dark passenger while still chasing connection. Across the franchise, we watch him rationalize. He spares Dokes until Leela intervenes. He tries to guide Miguel, then kills him when the experiment collapses. He lets Lumen go when her trauma arc feels complete. He even abandons Harrison in the original finale because, in his twisted logic, that sacrifice might protect the boy from his orbit. Flawed, selfish, delusional, yes, but consistently invested in survival and control. Cut to the finale. In this video, we're going to sit in that cabin and listen to how flat his confession suddenly becomes. Dexter doesn't argue for the code. He doesn't try to reframe Logan's death as a tragic miscalculation. He doesn't even reach for the old "I kill bad people" line. Instead, he collapses everything into a binary. I'm bad, you're good, I ruin everything. The only way forward is for you to kill me. It plays like a closing statement, not like something this character would improvise under pressure. And we're asked to believe he now values Harrison's moral purity more than his own survival. This is the same man who uprooted a carefully maintained alias, risked Angela's investigation, and walked straight back into the Bay Harbor Butcher spotlight just to be near his son. Suddenly, with one dead cop on the floor, he decides Harrison's soul is too precious to risk another day of his influence. Why here? Why now? The emotional impact is undeniable. The music swells, the rifle shakes, the snow absorbs the blood. For a moment, it feels like a tragic, inevitable endpoint. But when we match it against Dexter's long-term trajectory, the years of self-justification, the repeated escapes, the constant belief that he can still adjust the plan, the psychological groundwork for him choosing this exact ending is thin at best. Along the way, the show trained us to expect Dexter to wriggle out, pivot, or at least argue. Instead, he surrenders to the narrative need for closure. Hold on that image, Dexter in the snow, eyes open, blood blooming around him. Because, next, we need to zoom out and ask what this death actually accomplishes for the story and what it breaks in the process. Dexter's blood is still steaming in the snow when the next impossible image arrives. Harrison, a teenage boy who just shot his own father, quietly driving out of Iron Lake like he's leaving a seasonal job, not a homicide scene. No sirens, no perimeter, no paperwork, just a clean getaway painted as catharsis. To keep this clear, let's kick things off with what actually happens. Harrison pulls the trigger. Dexter dies. Angela rushes in, processes the scene in seconds, and makes a snap decision that would end the career of any real police chief. She sends Harrison away with some cash, a printed note for the story, and a vague promise to take the blame on herself. Then he gets in Dexter's truck and heads down an empty highway as the music swells. That's the finale's last plan, a symbolic release dressed up as closure. But the focus is not just on the emotion of that moment. It's on the investigation that never happens. Angela doesn't secure the scene. She doesn't call state police, doesn't radio for EMTs, doesn't even photograph Harrison's hands while they're still shaking and covered in gunshot residue. She moves Dexter's body, rearranges the narrative, and lets the only eyewitness and shooter vanish with zero documentation. How is that anything but a complete procedural collapse? Think about Angela's trajectory for a second. This is a woman who spent the season painstakingly tracking missing Indigenous women, challenging jurisdictional apathy, and piecing together Kurt's bunker through thin threads of evidence. Suddenly, in the most high-profile killing of her life, the death of a man she now believes is the Bay Harbor Butcher, she abandons every instinct, every protocol, every ounce of hard-won control. Why does the show ask us to accept that? Because the systems that should roar to life here simply never exist. No state police swarming the cabin. No FBI descending when a suspected serial killer dies in custody. No child protective services intervening for a traumatized minor who just committed a homicide. Where's the forensic review of the shooting, the autopsy that notes angle, distance, and stippling, the psychological evaluation Harrison would be forced into for months or years? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to this pattern. When the story wants a clean emotional beat, institutions evaporate. From a legal standpoint, Harrison is radioactive, connected to multiple crime scenes, present at Kurt's kill bunker, now responsible for killing a man his own police chief arrested. Yet the finale treats him like a hitchhiker exiting the plot. No bolo on the truck. No ab. No follow-up interview. Just a mythic image, the son driving away from the father's sins. And that's the central question this section leaves us with. If no one truly investigates Dexter's death, did the show actually resolve anything? Or just hit the off switch and hope we wouldn't notice? Along the way, we have to ask what that erasure sets up next. Because a world that ignores a crime this big is a world where the consequences are only pretending to be over. If that erasure is the strategy, then Dexter's death is supposed to be the clean reset. Bullet fired, body down, slate wiped. But the second we look at what's actually left on the board, the illusion of control collapses again. Iron Lake isn't a town with closure. It's an active crime scene, with the main suspect conveniently removed. Let's kick things off with the literal investigations. Kurt's underground bunker full of embalmed bodies is exposed, filmed, and then, what? We never see a state task force descend on Iron Lake, no FBI profilers walking that hallway of glass coffins, no real attempt to map his victim list across missing persons databases. The Christmas cabin, where Dexter and Harrison butcher Kurt, it burns to the ground, soaked in blood, loaded with trace evidence, and the show treats it as an aesthetic fireball rather than a forensic goldmine. Where are the cadaver dogs, the arson reports, the search for additional bodies in those woods? To keep this clear, the failure is not that the town is traumatized. The failure is that the story pretends law enforcement procedure just stops. Multiple missing women are now confirmed homicides. Molly Park vanishes after investigating both Kurt and Dexter. There's a destroyed kill room, a serial killer's bunker, and a cop who arrests the Bay Harbor butcher in her small town jail. That combination should trigger federal alarms on every level. Instead, Angela makes a few phone calls, releases Harrison, and we fade out as if the investigation has been neatly filed away. And then there are the people left in the dark. Batista gets the call that Dexter is alive, connected to the Bay Harbor case, and on the verge of exposure. Miami Metro is one plane ride away from watching their entire past investigation implode. Anyone who ever doubted that Dokes was the butcher finally has a path to the truth. But Dexter dies before Batista arrives, and the show never shows us his reaction. Deb's old colleagues processing the revelation, or Rita's kids learning what really happened to the man who raised them. The focus is not just on who pulls the trigger, it's on who never gets to ask a single follow-up question. That's where the thematic loose ends start to fray. Harrison kills Dexter, but what does he actually inherit? A half-explained code, a single night of vigilante bonding, and a lifetime of unresolved rage. We're told this is Harrison breaking the cycle, yet the final image is a traumatized teenager driving off alone with a gun in his bag and no support system. Is that closure, or just a new trajectory for the same damaged psychology? In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that central question. Did New Blood close the book, or just slam it shut mid-chapter? Unanswered investigations, uninformed survivors, unexamined legacy, an untested code, a runaway son, a burned cabin, a bunker of bodies. The section that follows has to ask whether a finale this unfinished can ever really count as an ending, or if Dexter's world is still bleeding out off-screen. So we end up with this strange crime scene of a season, a burned cabin, a dead father, a missing son, and a town that should be buzzing with investigations that never happen. To keep this clear, we need to pull back from individual moments and look at the pattern. What, exactly, is New Blood trying to do, and do these plot holes actually break that plan beyond repair? Let's kick things off by grouping what we've already uncovered. Dexter's implausible low profile in Iron Lake is the foundation crack. For 10 years, he moves through background checks, hunting licenses, police ride-alongs, and hospital records, and no one ever tugs the thread. On top of that, we have Harrison's psychology swinging, from wounded teenager to eager code disciple, in the span of a few snowstorms. Then there's Angela's investigation, jumping from a single needle mark to the Bay Harbor butcher, with almost no procedural scaffolding. Add Kurt's impossible operation, an underground mausoleum, and a multi-year abduction pattern that never triggers state or federal pressure. Finally, everything culminates in a rushed, contrived finale, where arrests, escapes, and a point-blank execution all unfold in a time window that barely respects basic protocol. On paper, that sounds like structural collapse. But the focus is not just on what fails, it's on what actually works. Atmospherically, New Blood is potent. The cold air, the isolated woods, the sense that the snow itself is trying to bury Dexter's past gives the season a clear trajectory. Performances carry a lot of weight. Michael C. Hall leans into an older Dexter whose control is fraying, while Jack Alcott gives Harrison this unnerving blend of neediness and menace that, at least in flashes, sells the idea that the code might be hereditary damage. The core idea is strong. Force Dexter to face consequences not through the legal system, but through the one relationship he can't rationalize away. So here's the paradox. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to a season obsessed with justice and accountability that refuses to hold its own story accountable to internal logic. How can we take Dexter's final reckoning seriously when his cover identity only collapses because of podcast trivia and TV speed detective work. How are we supposed to invest in Harrison's moral crisis when his psychology bends to whatever the episode needs him to believe about the code? Each major section will keep pressing on that tension. Are these just surface-level cracks, the kind of shortcuts prestige TV takes all the time to keep the plot moving? Or are they structural failures that hollow out the moral and emotional consequences New Blood claims to deliver? Because if the investigation doesn't track, if Kurt's bunker is impossible, if the finale's logistics don't hold, then Dexter's death risks feeling less like inevitability and more like writerly convenience. The next sections are going to slow down and measure that gap, scene by scene, before we finally answer the central question. So let's kick things off with the most basic, brutal mismatch between premise and execution. Iron Lake is a tiny town that behaves like a faceless metropolis whenever Dexter needs to disappear. We're told this is the place where everyone knows everyone, where gossip moves faster than Wi-Fi, where a stranger buying the wrong brand of coffee would start a week of speculation. And yet Dexter Morgan, human crime scene magnate, can stand in the blast radius of every major incident without becoming the center of a serious, sustained investigation. To keep this clear, track his trajectory. Matt disappears after a highly public confrontation in Dexter's shop. Dexter is on the search parties. He's living in an isolated cabin that just happens to sit on the path of Kurt's abductions. He's romantically involved with the chief of police, has sudden access to the station, and then a long-lost son with obvious psychological issues wanders into town and attaches himself to him. In a community that side-eyes every outsider, how does no one say, "Why is Jim Lindsay always right there when something collapses?" We get specific scenes that, in any real world, would put Dexter under a microscope. His cabin isn't just remote, it's exactly the sort of place you'd search thoroughly when a violent, drunk, rich kid vanishes near the woods. His relationship to Harrison should trigger background checks, school forms, social media curiosity, at least one nosy parent asking where this mysterious single dad came from. His presence in the police station, walking through evidence, helping Angela connect dots, should require documented clearance. His history with Kurt, the way Matt's father oscillates between hostility and weird acceptance, should generate rumors that never quite materialize. Instead, the season leans on selective blindness. Characters notice Dexter just enough to create tension, but never enough to follow through. Angela has a flash of suspicion, then drops it. Townsfolk whisper about Harrison, but not about the man who trained him. Even when Kurt is taken down in that blood-soaked cabin, Dexter and Harrison walk away from a crime scene that should light up state and federal radars, and Iron Lake just resets. The central question becomes unavoidable. Is this a tight-knit community? Or a narrative fog machine? The focus is not just on realism. It's on how the show advertises constant community surveillance while refusing to pay the consequences of that surveillance. We're told everyone notices outsiders, yet no one follows up on Dexter's patterns, his lies about Miami, his uncanny proximity to every body that drops. In Miami Metro, the scale at least gave Dexter statistical cover. Here, the same logic collapses. 10 suspicious coincidences in a city are noise. 10 in a rural town are a manhunt. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to that paradoxical thesis. The more visible Dexter is, the less anyone seems to see him. Right up until the finale suddenly overcorrects and has Angela crack the Bay Harbor butcher with podcast logic and one Dina hit. Along the way, we'll see how this low-profile illusion is structurally necessary for New Blood's big twists. But the moment you track his involvement scene by scene, every later turn, Angela's latest stage investigation, Harrison's embrace and rejection of the code, Dexter's death, stops feeling inevitable and starts feeling rushed, like the writers finally looked at their own town and realized what it should have noticed episodes ago. And nowhere does that rushed, late-breaking awareness hurt more than with Harrison, the person New Blood keeps insisting is the emotional core of this entire return. The season frames him as the reason Dexter breaks cover, the mirror that will finally force our killer to confront his legacy. But when you track the actual writing, Harrison isn't treated like a person with a coherent psychology. He's treated like a switch the plot can flip. Let's kick things off with his trajectory. Abandoned child in Argentina, edgy loner on the bus, trauma victim in therapy, school hero after the wrestling takedown, violent aggressor with the straight razor, and then, in what feels like a single narrative breath, eager student of the code. In this video, we're going to keep asking, where is the connective tissue? Where are the scenes that earn that escalation instead of just announcing it? To keep this clear, watch his emotional whiplash around violence. When Ethan fantasizes about a school shooting, Harrison is horrified, positioned as the kid who can't tolerate pointless cruelty. He shows empathy for victims, he calls out bullies, he's disgusted by bloodshed without purpose. But the moment Dexter frames Ethan as a would-be killer and spins vigilante murder as necessary, Harrison's resistance evaporates. How does a teenager go from shaking in a hospital hallway to casually accepting that stabbing someone in a kill room might be justice, in essentially 2 conversations? The central question the show never slows down to ask is what a dark passenger even means for someone who remembers his mother's death. We get hints, the podcast obsession, the self-harm imagery, the rage at abandonment. Yet there's no serious pushback on Dexter's rules, no extended moral debate, before Harrison is literally standing in plastic, watching his father carve up Kurt. The focus is not just on what Harrison does, but on how often the script skips the hard conversations that would give those actions weight. Look at the campfire confession. On paper, it should be the psychological spine of the season. Father and son, firelight, the code laid bare. Instead, Dexter speedruns 10 years of secrecy into a campfire TED Talk. And Harrison's response jumps from shock to intrigued to semi-accepting in minutes. The wrestling match works the same way. It could have grounded his anger in concrete humiliation, peer dynamics, real teenage consequences. Instead, it's used as a shortcut to he's like Dexter, a pretext to test whether he enjoys hurting someone. That's the paradox the season never resolves. Harrison has to be traumatized enough to understand Dexter's darkness, but stable enough to function as his conscience in the finale. So his stance changes whenever the plot needs a new gear, furious at killing, then thrilled by Kurt's execution, then morally repulsed again when the script needs him to pull the trigger. Contrast that with Dexter's original arc, where the investigation into his own soul takes seasons. Slowly building, constantly challenged, every change in the code coming with visible consequences. New Blood wants that same moral weight on fast forward. And that's how this unstable version of Harrison becomes the linchpin for the show's boldest move, Dexter's death at his son's hands. But does Harrison truly choose that? Or does the script choose for him? Next, we'll dissect the finale's logic and watch the entire plan collapse in real time. So while Harrison's psychology is speeding toward that final confrontation, Angela's investigation is doing its own high-speed skid. And here's the paradox. She is both the sharpest cop Dexter has ever faced and the least procedurally grounded. The central question becomes, are we watching a brilliant small-town detective or a writer's room trying to wrap a decade of Bay Harbor Butcher fallout in 3 episodes flat? Let's kick things off with the Dina trigger. Angela runs a sample from the overdose victim Dexter mercy kills, gets a hit on a dead Miami man named Dexter Morgan, and realizes Jim Lindsay is a lie. That alone should launch a slow, methodical inquiry, confirm the records, quietly pull Miami files, build a clean chain of custody. Instead, the show treats it as an instant serial killer profile. One partial match, and suddenly, Angela is staring at Jim like she solved an entire season-long investigation overnight. To keep this clear, look at what she actually has in hand. A fake name. A boyfriend who's oddly fluent in police work. A past in Miami, which, yes, once hosted the Bay Harbor butcher case. Later, she adds a few circumstantial overlaps, travel dates, missing people, a podcaster's speculation. That's not nothing. But it's a long way from my boyfriend is secretly the most notorious vigilante killer of the 2000s. Where are the subpoenas? The financials? The travel records? The victim timelines that would map Dexter's trajectory against confirmed kills? Instead, the Bay Harbor butcher leap happens almost entirely off-screen. Angela Googles, listens to Molly's podcast, prints some articles, and then, through a conveniently timed email chain, pulls in Batista. In this video, we're going to keep returning to these moments where the plan for a grounded investigation just evaporates. Batista arrives, delivers an exposition dump about Deborah, remembers Dexter a bit too perfectly, and in one conversation. Decades-old suspicions crystallize like they were just waiting for this crossover episode. Does that feel like organic police work? Or narrative bookkeeping? The focus is not just on what Angela notices, but on what she doesn't do. No clear warrants for key searches, no airtight chain of custody on the titanium screw, the ketamine link, the cabin evidence, no independent forensic review to insulate the case from her obvious personal bias as Dexter's partner. Any half-competent defense attorney would tear this apart. The investigation looks emotionally convincing, legally fragile. And that's the real failure. Angela's instincts are dead on, Dexter is dangerous, the code is a lie, the consequences are real. But the path the script gives her is so compressed and contrived that it undercuts the satisfaction of finally seeing someone catch him. Imagine a realistic slow burn, weeks of surveillance, quiet GPS pings, subpoenas on burner phones, cross-checking Iron Lake disappearances with Miami cold cases. Instead, we get a montage-style shortcut that jumps from suspicion to certainty because the finale needs him cornered. Along the way, New Blood swings from a world where no one suspects Dexter to a climax where Angela oversolves the case in record time. It makes for a dramatic arrest, but would any of it survive a real courtroom? That tension between emotional justice and procedural collapse is exactly what sets up Dexter's final plan to escape, and the rushed chain of decisions that will end his life in the next act. So as Angela's investigation starts sprinting ahead of its own evidence, the season quietly introduces Iron Lake's other monster. Kurt Caldwell, friendly diner owner, small-town benefactor, and, beneath a remote cabin in the woods, the curator of an underground trophy bunker that feels like Dexter's methodology turned into a roadside attraction. On the surface, he's the respectable businessman. Underneath, he's running a parallel code with none of the rules, just ritual and display. Let's kick things off with the image the show wants burned into our brains. That lonely cabin, the trapdoor, and the antiseptic corridor opening into a subterranean gallery of the dead. Bodies standing upright in glass cases. Preserved skin. Elaborate lighting rigs that highlight each victim like a museum exhibit. This isn't a hasty kill room. It's a permanent facility. Concrete work, ventilation, climate control, custom doors, electrical panels, years of construction and maintenance, disguised as, what, a hunting shack? To keep this clear, the central question is not whether a serial killer could fantasize about a bunker like this. Of course he could. The problem is the logistics of building and operating it in a tiny town where everyone knows who's pouring the concrete. Where are the permits? The contractors? The trucks hauling in lumber, rebar, generators, fuel? At minimum, someone files a land record, a neighbor hears heavy equipment at night, a hunter stumbles across a cleared access road. Instead, Iron Lake behaves like a vacuum that politely refuses to notice excavation. Then there's the victim pattern. Decades of missing women, many tied to the same truck stop, vanishing along a consistent corridor. Families call. Friends ask questions. State police share databases. In any world that resembles ours, those disappearances eventually cohere into a task force, a profile. At least a whispered urban legend. Here, they're treated as background noise, tragic but unconnected, so Kurt can keep adding exhibits while the town gathers at his diner and thanks him for sponsoring the wrestling team. Layer on the surveillance and technology angle, and the bunker strains even further. Kurt has cameras, access points, electric locks, and a power draw that would absolutely show up on a rural grid. Hunters roam these woods, hikers, snowmobilers, teenagers looking for a secluded spot, yet no one ever trips a motion sensor, follows a buried cable, or asks why this abandoned cabin has steady electricity through every winter storm. In this video, we're going to keep returning to this pattern. The bunker isn't discovered because of organic, investigative work. It appears on cue because Dexter and Harrison need a horror set piece and a moral mirror. Kurt's implausible secrecy rhymes with Dexter's. Iron Lake flips from hyper-observant to completely oblivious, depending on which killer the script needs protected that week. Along the way, Kurt's bunker becomes a perfect symbol for New Blood's larger problem. Visually striking, thematically loaded. But the moment we ask, how would this actually work? The structure collapses. If the show will bend reality this far for a cabin in the woods, what happens when we get to the finale's biggest set piece, the jail cell, the escape, and the last confrontation? Does that too run on cool first, coherent later logic? So let's kick things off in that cramped Iron Lake station, where every illusion of control is about to implode. Dexter is arrested, the fate of Jim Lindsay is stripped away, and Angela finally says the words the original series danced around: Bay Harbor Butcher. On paper, this is the moment we've been waiting for. In practice, the investigation that gets us here is built on a podcast, a single old case file, and a partial Dina hit that somehow never triggers a full federal swarm. To keep this clear, walk the sequence step by step. Angela confronts Dexter with the ketamine link, the Miami victims, the pattern that ties his past life to her quiet town. She has motive, circumstantial evidence, and a gut feeling. What she does not have is a body from Iron Lake that connects to Miami, a verified chain of custody on half of what she's waving in his face, or any believable sense that the state police are about to lock this down. The central question becomes, why doesn't Dexter, the forensic analyst who survived the Bay Harbor Butcher investigation, just fight this in court? Instead, his plan is to escape, not to dismantle the case, not to weaponize reasonable doubt, just break out of a small-town cell in the middle of a high-profile murder investigation. The focus is not just on the choice, but on what it requires him to do next. He calls Logan in, fakes a medical emergency, and when the hold doesn't slip fast enough, he snaps Logan's neck and steals his gun. This is the same Dexter who spent 8 seasons insisting the code forbids killing innocents, the same father who supposedly came to Iron Lake to protect Harrison from his darkness. Killing Dokes was a line he refused to cross. Killing Logan is treated as a tactical inconvenience. That isn't an evolution of Dexter's psychology. It's a collapse. We're told he's trying to be a better father, then asked to accept that he'll casually murder Harrison's wrestling coach because the script needs him irredeemable by sunrise. And the logistics of the jailbreak itself? One deputy on duty, no backup called the moment a nationally significant suspect is arrested, no cameras that matter, no lockdown. Dexter moves through the station like it's Season 1 Miami at 3 a.m., not a crime scene waiting to happen. Tension is high, but it's manufactured by stripping away every protocol a real investigation would trigger. Then comes the pivot. Harrison arrives at the rendezvous and, almost instantly, becomes the show's moral compass. After episodes of flirting with the code, enjoying the kill with Kurt, and echoing his father's language about purpose, he now diagnoses Dexter as the problem, cites Logan's death as unforgivable, and delivers a clean thesis about cycles of violence. Has his arc actually earned that certainty, or is he suddenly speaking for the writer's room? The scene leans hard on music, slow motion, and callbacks to Deb, to Harry, to the idea that this bullet is inevitable and poetic. But look at the decisions that line it up. No attempt at a public trial, no long-term cat and mouse with Angela, no internally driven confession that pays off Dexter's mounting guilt from the original series. Instead, Harrison is handed a rifle and a monologue so that one shocking image can close the season. In this video, we're going to argue that this is the paradox of New Blood's finale. It finally punishes Dexter realistically, but only after making him act unrealistically to get there. The season is retroactively framed as a morality play about ending the cycle, yet most of its trajectory never builds that case with consistency. Was this truly Dexter's natural endpoint, or a mandate to generate a headline and a sense of closure, no matter how many character beats had to break? In the next section, we'll pull back even further and track what this choice does to the legacy of the entire saga. So, when we pull back from individual scenes and look at Dexter New Blood as one long, final plan, something bleak comes into focus. The collapse isn't just Dexter's, it's the show's. The season keeps staging big moments of exposure and consequence, but the scaffolding holding them up is cracked at almost every joint. To keep this clear, think about the core structural failures we've tracked. Dexter supposedly maintains a low profile in a tiny town where everyone knows everyone, yet he's surrounded by cops. Leaves digital and physical trails, and still passes as an invisible ghost for a decade. Harrison's psychology whiplashes from wounded kid to eager code disciple to moral judge in a handful of episodes. Angela's investigation jumps from a partial Dina hit and a single podcast to You're the Bay Harbor Butcher with almost no procedural grind. Kurt's bunker operates for years without a serious state or federal response. Then, the finale forces every character into the narrowest possible tunnel of behavior just to get Dexter shot in the snow. These aren't isolated nitpicks. They're connected symptoms of a single creative choice. Again and again, the season chooses short-term shock and momentum over long-term coherence and earned evolution. Need Harrison on board with killing? Compress his arc. Need Angela to crack the case? Skip the real investigation. Need Kurt to be a grand monster? Handwave the logistics of his underground trophy room. The plan is always to get to the next twist, even if the world and the psychology we've been given have to bend out of shape to allow it. That's especially striking when we remember how the original series, for all its own failures, usually grounded Dexter's double life in pattern, procedure, and internal conflict. From Dokes stalking him to the Bay Harbor Butcher task force, Dexter's exposure felt like a tragic possibility baked into the design. We watched a man whose need for control carried its own forensic footprint. When things fell apart, they fell apart along lines the show had been sketching for years. New Blood tries to give us the ending many people asked for: Dexter confronted, exposed, and finally stopped. But the paradox is brutal. In this video, we're going to keep coming back to the central question: does that ending count if the road there ignores the very rules and psychology that made him compelling? A character built on meticulous ritual is taken out by narrative shortcuts. A saga about consequences ends with a finale that refuses to live by its own, and that has an emotional cost. Harrison's transformation feels rushed, so his final act lands less like a painful inevitability and more like the writers moving a piece into position. Angela's triumph is undercooked because her investigation never has to withstand real scrutiny. Iron Lake never feels like a fully realized community, yet it's asked to carry the weight of being Dexter's last stage. So here's the invitation. Rewatch the season and track when characters behave like themselves versus when they suddenly act like vehicles for the next big moment. Ask yourself, once you can see the scaffolding, does the final shot still hit, or does it feel like a magic trick where we've now spotted the wires? Was this the only possible end of Dexter's trajectory, or just the quickest? From a syringe in Miami to a rifle in the woods, Dexter Morgan was built as a man whose every plan contained the seeds of its own failure. New Blood wanted to complete that circle. The focus is not just on whether he dies, but on whether the story earns the way he falls. So let's kick things off in the comments. Tell us the single plot hole that broke the illusion for you. Did it happen with Angela's leap, Harrison's turn, Kurt's bunker, or Dexter's final escape attempt? Drop your breakdowns and let us know which other finales or failed endgames you want us to autopsy next. Along the way, we'll keep following the trail of stories where the plan falls apart on screen and behind the scenes, and what that collapse tells us about the characters we thought we knew.